So it's 12:03. Let's go ahead and call this meeting as a continuation from last week. If you could please do roll call, and we will, you said there's one joining over Zoom.
As you are aware, on March 4th, Governor Newsom declared a state of emergency in California due to the threat of COVID-19. The governor also passed several executive orders, including the suspension of some components of the Brown Act related to public meetings like this one. As such, Commissioner Perez Andreessen is participating by phone. So we have Chair Sanders,
Present.
Vice Chair Hibbard, here. Perez Andreessen,
Sorry, here.
Holt,
Here.
Keller, here. Louis,
Here.
Prince,
Here.
Roland,
Here.
Tobias.
Here.
Thank you. To the old agenda. Jenny, are we using the old agenda?
Madam Chair, no, I believe there's a new agenda that should have been provided to you. And the next thing on the agenda would be, actually, it's the adoption from the May 26th, so that, they already took action on that. Was that the last time we met? Was that a week ago?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so then that is the second item, then adoption of the minutes from your last meeting, May 26, 2020.
And even though we didn't close that meeting, we still have minutes for that meeting? Yeah. Yep. Yes, thank you. Does anybody have the minutes in front of them? Mr. Prince, you do? From last week? Hmm. We're getting them right now, so give us just a hot minute.
I have them too, Beatrice.
Hey, Edwin, can you print and bring over the minutes from the last PSVS meeting? It should be on the S drive under board.
So we don't have any minutes.
Then we're just going to go ahead and defer that item and go to the next one.
Let's do that, and that will be public comment. Have you received any wishes to speak? I know that we did receive one email for comment that we all have.
We have received correspondence from Eddie Lane and have provided it as a blue memo and have added it to the permanent record. In addition, we have received 2 additional public speaker cards, the first of which is from Mr. Michael Turnipseed, and he has provided written documents that I've provided to the committee.
Wonderful.
Madam Chair, members of the Oversight Committee, I'm Michael Turnipseed. I represent the Kern County Taxpayers Association. I'm going to do a little reminiscing today over Measure N from 2018 till now. The people 18 months ago voted by the narrowest of margins to have support Measure N. Since that time, the city has spent roughly $80 million of Measure N money through your committee and through the council and through staff. One of the obvious things that's taken place, if you remember back in 2018, there were yard signs all around town. Measure N for a safer Bakersfield. Remember those? There were probably a couple hundred, couple thousand running around town. You'd see them. And so the real question today, 18 months later and $80 million later, Is Bakersfield safer today than it was in November of 2018? We spent a lot of money on a lot of different things, of which $22 million of the $80 million are ongoing costs that are automatically put into this year's budget. And depending on what you do today, there's another $17 million in the current expenditure of ongoing costs. That's $39 million. That's roughly 60% of the $69 million that you're going to have total to spend. I think there should be real concern. There hasn't been discussion if we're mortgaging our future. Are we having so many ongoing costs that we're not going to be able to meet the city's needs down the road? I sat around my house all weekend watching TV and watching things and watching damage to the police station, broken windows, graffiti. And I think the question, I received a few phone calls, and when people ask me, are we really safer than we were 18 months ago? Because that was the pledge for a safer Bakersfield. And I said, I can't answer that question. Maybe you can talk about that today, because you have to think about and recommend, is our money being spent with the number one priority being a safer Bakersfield? Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Turnipseed. Did you say there was one more?
Yes, we've received a speaker card from Mr. Eddie Lane.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I passed out a one-page sheet today instead of 10. I regret that the words that I was reported to have said will be counted in Sunday's May 31 article in the Californian about Measure In. To make clear, I did not and would not say that the poor condition of local parks was the reason some people chose not to move to Bakersfield. Such a sweeping indictment of the condition of our city's parks is simply untrue. I don't know my precise language, but I regret that somehow that language that was printed there was mine. It was not. As an advocate for city parks, I wanted to clarify this to you today in person. This is not to overlook issues of concern which I and others have raised with regard to specific parks. Much of Sunday's article did get it right. Let me put on my Sierra Club hat. We are concerned about community involvement in decision-making and have requested that there be ward-by-ward meetings asking neighborhoods about their needs for the parks. We're deeply concerned about the proposed reduction from $12.8 million to $3.5 million in Measure N funding for recreation and parks. We continue to ask that the 22 parks within 5 miles of Bakersfield City Hall receive equitable Measure N funding on par with Mesa Marin and Kaiser Permanente, which will be approximately $15 million during the next 2 fiscal years. We continue to be concerned about the procedural issues which we brought up. We continue to request that solar energy be used in both Mesa Marin and Kaiser Permanente, and that each have electric vehicle charging stations. We continue to be concerned about the lack of public transportation to those 2 developments. We also continue to be concerned specifically about Kaiser Permanente, about the $2.5 million in city funds which had already been allocated before Measure N was passed. We enthusiastically support the Bakersfield Park system and the priorities in the Measure N ballot, which were used last year to allocate 22% of the funds for Measure N funding. These are quality of life issues. We would urge your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lane. Seeing no other public comments, I just wanted to take this moment and ask any of my committee members, including Mrs. Perez Andreessen, who's joining us over the phone, if they have any comments that they'd like to start the meeting with. Yep, go ahead.
I just want to apologize for not being able to make the last meeting. There was a scheduling conflict that couldn't be fixed. But having watched the nearly 3 hours on YouTube, I was able to gather everything, so I'm prepared to vote today on anything.
Thank you. Anybody else? Mr. Rowland? Okay. All right, so then we'll hand it over.
Good afternoon, our committee members. Again, Christian Clegg, City Manager. Just wanted to reflect that since our last meeting, we have had a few individuals from the committee reach out to city staff to seek some clarification on some items and get some information on those items. Some of that was related to affordable housing and what those dollars represented. Some of that was related to some of our projections around sales tax. And so just would open it up and actually invite any committee members if they wanted to ask staff to share that information with the committee at large on some of the follow-up that they did, that we're prepared to do that. We're also prepared to answer questions in general related to any of the items. And then we don't have a set presentation for today. We presented, the information at our last meeting. What we have up on the slide deck are the recommendations that we made last week, broken out into sections that could be digestible components that the committee could take up for discussion and motions and votes. So those are broken up into basic categories like public safety and economic development. And so the slides that we have prepared are really to just facilitate that discussion and recommendation and motion process, but we don't have a set presentation beyond that.
Well, good afternoon, committee members. Chris Hewitt, City Manager's Office. As Mr. Clegg mentioned, we have a couple of slides prepared for you this afternoon. You should have copies up on the dais. As Mr. Clegg mentioned, they are essentially outlined in relationship to the categories that are on your agenda today under the deferred business item. So again, I'm not going to spend a bunch of time walking through each of these slides. I just want to orient you to how they are structured. And the information that is provided. We do have department heads in the audience to answer any questions. And as Mr. Clegg mentioned, at the end of today's discussion, we are looking for the committee to make recommendations based upon those 13 priorities that we had previously talked about. And just again, to give you a little bit of insight to our budget process, normally we're spread out over about 2.5, 3 months of public meetings related to the budget. We've had to condense that. We'll be back to the City Council, I believe, on June 8th, next Monday, for a second budget workshop, followed by a budget hearing on Wednesday evening, the 10th, and then adoption is scheduled for the 24th. So if there are recommendations and comments to get to the City Council, it would be appropriate, in our view today, if we could, to get those for the sake of making sure that we can encapsulate that and push that package on to the council. Again, this is not going to be in depth. I just want to walk quickly through public safety, the police department, and the proposals totaling $8.2 million. Again, you're going to see some items broken out there, including the new positions, activities, capital projects, contingent projects, and again, as you recall, contingent projects are those projects that are identified as necessary and needed, but would not be activated, so to speak, until around January of 2021, when we're able to track our revenues and make sure that we're meeting revised projections. And again, we have several new pieces of equipment, as you see below. This is in response to the majority of the priorities that are contained within the measure as it relates to putting additional officers on the street. So the chief mentioned last time, there is some significant lead time to hiring, equipping, and deploying those officers. We're a net increase today of 25 to the complement, which again places more officers on the street to respond to calls. We anticipate that number to increase as we move forward in implementing phase 2 and beyond. Regarding the fire department, again, 13 new positions, a handful of capital projects. Again, as a reminder, these fire stations are essentially the hub, 14 hubs in which the department provides responses out of. Without upkeep and continual investment in those facilities, we would not be able to, in part, provide that Class 2 level response and fire department that we're seeking to maintain. So these are important there. Again, arson captain vehicle for the one arson captain position that is being proposed for addition. On the homeless front, another significant investment this year, first adding additional rapid response team members to code enforcement, looking to move into the operating phase of the homeless center that the city will be finishing up here in the fall. And then there are several capital projects, one involving affordable housing, a $3 million allocation July 1, a $4.3 million allocation contingent, and then 2 projects that are intended to make some significant direct neighborhood improvements to the areas around the 2 shelters, one being the cities down off of Brundage, and then the counties off of M Street here just north of downtown, and then some additional equipment as it relates to the rapid response team. Fiscal Stability, the $9.5 million allocation to reserve and contingencies, continuing in recommendation of this committee to be putting away funding for a rainy day, essentially. So again, this was something that this committee recommended and the council adopted. This continues that. Economic recovery, about $4.5 million specifically tied to kind of this function. It involves really kind of a crossover of 2 different departments. One is our Development Services Department, and the other is our newly created Economic Development Department. So the positions that you see there are a combination of those that are included in the proposal that cross over for both departments. Have the tech, the accounting clerk, the homeless principal, and the business manager on the economic development side of things, the development services tech on the development services side of things. That position specifically is meant to help with the update of the city's general plan and beyond. The update of the general plan is really the foundation in which we're going to be moving the city forward as it relates to development and economic development. So that's why it is certainly categorized here. There were several different initiatives and activities that Mr. Clegg outlined last time, that in some cases some new initiatives to spur on economic development, entice businesses to both open up and to be retained and grow the workforce here in the city of Bakersfield. Some Clean City Initiative projects, and then again that urban revitalization and redevelopment project. Last year there was $1.2 million that was allocated. We're proposing to add another $1.2 million in the coming year for property acquisition, property redevelopment, and urban revitalization. There was a set of council goals and initiatives and organization initiatives that we covered. It involved the addition of 1 position in the city manager's office with several different activities revolving around internal efficiencies and legislative advocacy, some long-range fiscal planning, which again is in line with some of the recommendations and discussion this committee's had, as well as the city council. And again, some other items there with the intent of making our internal processes and procedures and our employees more efficient. Be happy to cover any more of those in detail if you wish. Recreation and Parks. When you look at both what's being proposed in phase 2 from an operating, meaning a staffing side, plus capital, plus equipment, that gets us to about $5.8 million. That's the addition of essentially another rapid response team. And what that rapid response team is really meant to do is supplement and augment the existing workforce to be able to better maintain all parks within the city system, both here in the core area and as we move out towards the periphery. We operate 60 parks, about to be 61 here in the next couple weeks. So these teams are very critical. Yes, sir.
Are you saying in the $5.8 million proposed that there's, I see the new positions listed. Which one of those are rapid response team members?
All of them.
All of them?
Yes,
okay.
sir.
Thank you.
That's essentially what makes up that rapid response team. The clerk typist, because of the volume of calls that Recreation and Parks receives, this clerk typist is critical as a backbone position to help deploy these teams. New equipment, again, those are all meant to support rapid response. And let's talk a little bit about the capital projects on the park side. The first 2 are local neighborhood park type projects. Again, one is some lighting at the Beach Park Skate Park. This will provide additional hours of use for youth to utilize that popular amenity. And then Patriots Park, what we're calling access improvements. We have several parks, again, with playground or parking lots and other access points that are in need of some significant work. This will provide for a better user experience overall. And again, you can see those contingent projects we talked about last time, mostly revolving around access enhancement, some beautification, and other safety improvements that are there for your review. I did not mean to move over the Phase 4, the Kaiser Permanente Sports Village. We were in front of you last year saying that going into fiscal year 21, we were going to need $8 million. That amount has been reduced to $3 million. And again, that is the local match to leverage a $3 million federal grant. Without that, the federal grant would not be accessible. Mechanics Bank Arena, again, just a few projects here that are necessary, again, to continue to provide the level of entertainment and shows that the community is accustomed to, broken into 2 primary projects and then 2 contingent projects. And then we lumped quite a bit into the support services non-departmental side of the house, totaling $4.6 million. So again, a lot of these positions are those that are behind the scenes making the projects that are a part of this measure and in supporting a lot of those frontline staff, whether they be in police, fire, code, parks. All of these positions are ensuring that those individuals and those services can be rendered. So we have a handful of positions in these different areas. Something new, it's technically compartmentalized in the non-departmental budget for now, but I mentioned last time that the city is seeking what's called a Calvet Grant, which is a violence intervention type of grant from the state. It does require that the city have staff available to manage that grant. And these would be the positions. It's essentially 2.5 positions, a program manager, an analyst, and then a part-time clerk. And Mr. Clegg can certainly provide some additional information on that should there be questions. Same bucket in terms of activities under the HR heading. We had some discussion last time about recruitment efforts to get those officers hired and on the street. Given the circumstances that other cities are facing, we think there's opportunity for additional enhancement in lateral hiring. We also believe that there's an opportunity to further incentivize hiring of officers to, again, be able to get us to our goal of 100 officers in 3 years. This committee, again, was recommending strongly last year that we look to implement a streetlight program. We are, again, getting a study underway, should be done in a couple months, and when it's done, we'd like to transition and pivot to constructing and implementing those streetlights in those areas that are identified in that study. So that's that first project under capital projects. Then we have, again, if you recall last year, we have a police garage that sits just behind us here. And this committee recommended and the council approved about $30,000 last year for design of expanding that garage to accommodate the additional vehicles that were going to be utilized as part of our enhanced responses through the police department. So this is that phase 2 that we talked about last year, $300,000. And then the employee management software again. Yes, sir. And I believe design.
No. Yes, we've met with, it's not completed, but we've met with. Chair, committee members, Nick Fidler, Public Works Director. If we're referring to the downtown police garage remodel, we have met with contractors to get an idea of the scope of work. So we do know what the costs are and what the design is, but the design has not been complete yet.
So, did we have to pay for the information that you just said that we have? I mean, we allocated $30,000, I think, for a design.
We're using in-house staff to do the design for a portion of it. With the contractors we consulted with, no, at this point we have not spent the fees yet, but we have used staff time for our capital improvement program, our designers are paid through the capital improvement program. It has been delayed. We have lost some of our design engineers over the past year, so we had 2 engineer 3s retire, or not retire, just leave. So that is why it's been delayed. We've been trying to pick up and hire an engineer, but been unsuccessful. But we have, with staff, been working with contractors to get the cost to do the project, to complete it.
And then quickly, a couple contingent projects that we talked about last time. I won't cover in great detail, but they are some city beautification and enhancement, quality of life type projects that I can certainly provide more detail should you choose to request that. And then finally, some new equipment, one for the maintenance craft worker that's being proposed in general services. That type of worker supports the maintenance and upkeep of city facilities, including those that are funded through PSVS. And then there are 2 additional pieces of equipment, a grapple truck and a scissor lift, that are both requested for the purpose of, again, making sure that these facilities are maintained and upkept. So I'm just going to walk quickly through the numbers like we talked about last time. Again, phase 1 was what the ongoing cost associated with phase 1, the positions, the programs and services that this committee recommended last year. Total about $21 million going into next year. We're not here to really rehash those items. Those have already been reviewed by this committee. Looking at that phase 2 number, we've calculated the ongoing cost for the phase 2 going into next year at about $16.6 million for a total of about $37.6 million of ongoing costs through PSVS. This is capital, essentially one time. So this is summarizing by department those capital projects that I just spoke about. Again, a little bit different categorization, but the numbers remain the same, about 19.2. I talked about contingent projects. Contingent projects total about $7.2 million. So again, that's one of our 3 or 4 buffers that we have in place to account for what could be potentially a further downturn. Again, we've reduced revenue projections. I'll talk about that in a moment significantly, but this is one of those tools we have built into this plan if revenues are not meeting projections. So when you look at phase 1, phase 2, ongoing operating, and then capital, this is how it totals out in terms of departments. So this is all appropriations for next fiscal year as proposed, giving phase 1, phase 2, and capital. Just to give you an idea of how we're getting to that $69.62 million figure. I'll break it down a little bit different here. Police department and economic development are at about 24%. Again, the fire department about 10%. So public safety is over 1/3 of this proposal. As you'll note, contingencies are about 14%. Again, in line with the recommendations and discussions that we've had previously. Number of positions. Again, this is just a summarized list of the number of positions so you can kind of get a sense of where they are allocated to, with public safety being the top priority in terms of position allocation. The 91 number, the total, is actually a reduction in the number of positions that departments had proposed through a vetting process with the city manager's office. We recognize that bringing the committee and the council the full slate of positions was not prudent given the circumstances. So I can assure you that there has been work done on our end to narrow down this list. So again, just to kind of give you an idea of how that staffing rounded percentages look, police and fire make up the lion's share of that staffing. So a couple takeaways, and then I'll wrap up, open it up for discussion and questions. We believe that this proposal for phase 2 addresses those 13 priorities as outlined in the resolution and as identified in those surveys and feedback that the city staff and the council received during the measure discussion. Public safety, as you can see through the numbers, is number 1. It's the top priority of the city, as we talked about last year. There is some lag time, especially on the PD side, to really begin to see the fruits of the investment that the community has made. And we are, again, seeing that now, 25 net increase on the PD side to sworn officers, with additional officers coming off of field training here in the next short term. We have what I'm calling an intense economic recovery planning component to this proposal that is going to be much needed. But this proposal also has what I'm calling, again, 4 layers of fiscal buffers. We talked a little bit, it's not part of this proposal, but we know that we're likely going to end the current year with a balance, meaning that positions that may have not been filled on July 1, savings related to projects, et cetera, that may have already been completed and came in under budget. So we view that as our first layer, meaning I believe Mr. Clegg has recommended that that be held in contingency. We've reduced our revenue projections significantly, essentially implementing what we're calling a recession type of projection. We have our $9.5 million reserve contingency allocation, and then finally we have that $7.2 million of contingent projects. So while we are looking to add new positions and continue to press on those key priorities, we're doing so with a restraint and an understanding that the next several quarters will be telling in terms of revenues, and that we recognize that, and we believe this is a proposal that encapsulates that. So today, again, what we're looking for is for the committee, based upon the ordinance and the measure, to act in that advisory capacity to review those expenditures of revenue generated by the measure, make those recommendations based upon the categories that I've outlined here, with the recommendation from staff that the committee find that the proposals are consistent with those 13 measures that are contained within the packet that we provided last time. And again, given the time constraints that we're under right now, we will likely be getting these proposals and your feedback and recommendations to the council as soon as next Monday, no later than that, most likely in both written form and in a summary feedback through a presentation. I want to leave this slide up here right now. That concludes my presentation. I have staff from several departments behind me, and I will defer to Mr. Clegg if he has any further comment.
My only comment is actually to recommend that the committee take up the topic of public safety first in the meeting. With everything going on in the community today, our police chief has a commitment to go to shortly, and so we would just ask that we address public safety initially, and after that, it's at the will of the committee how to take up each of those items.
So let's do that. I'm going to open up to any comments to my fellow committee members. Any further questions, and then we can go into public safety.
I had a question. This is Connie.
Connie, ask away.
Okay, it's a question I emailed city staff regarding the memo that was provided for last week's meeting. In that memo, we were informed that the governor announced the state will allow small businesses with less than $5 million in taxable annual sales to defer payment of sales and use taxes up to $50,000 for up to 12 months, which will impact measure sales tax collections for fiscal year 21. And my question to city staff was if we know how many small businesses in the city fall under that threshold and what the potential impact would be to our cash flow.
Yes, committee member through the chair, we did receive that information from our sales tax consultant. It's one of the items that we looked at in developing our analysis for revenue projections next year. We anticipate, based upon current records, that would theoretically apply, that deferral would theoretically apply to about 5,300 sales tax license or permits businesses, if you will, within the city. And again, that can be a business that produces $1 in sales tax all the way up to the maximum that is identified as a small business. In terms of cash, that is built in to our revenue projections. It looks like it's a potential of about a $1.4 million maximum hit to city revenues through sales tax. But again, that's offset by, I believe, the second part of your inquiry, which was related to the Wayfair decision.
Yeah.
The Wayfair decision, as I mentioned last time, was a Supreme Court decision that essentially required the collection and remittance of sales tax for certain online sales and out-of-state transactions, where previously that sales tax was not collected or remitted uniformly. And we believe, based upon conservative estimates, we discounted actually our consultants' estimates. We believe that that is worth about $1 million a quarter moving forward, even under our revised recession scenario. So I hope that that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I'll just make a general comment. It really doesn't, we don't need an answer on it, but just a comment moving forward. And then I have a question for the police chief. But I brought it up at the last meeting, and Mr. Turnipseed brought it up, but and my math isn't exactly the same, but year one, we have about 21 million committed, which is 30% of this year's estimated revenue. This year, we're proposing 16.6 million, which is another 24%. So I'm at like 54% committed for ongoing costs. And I think my comment would be, I think I'm looking for a little more analysis from staff on where that's going. We also have some commitments to the 100 officers we want to hire. So that's going to go up. And I don't know where we're going to be comfortable with ongoing set costs, because at this rate, it's not going to be long, and there's not going to be a lot of decisions to be made by this committee. So I think moving forward, I think that's an important topic to look at and discuss, as far as, do we want to put some kind of a cap or policy on our long-term commitments out of this particular fund moving forward. So that's just a general comment, but.
If I may, committee member through the chair, just 3 thoughts to that comment. One, I agree that it's a worthwhile conversation about, how do we make sure we leave ourselves room for important initiatives. 2, there's some city council interest been expressed in that same topic at our budget workshop on the 27th. That question was raised. 3, one of the items in the council initiatives listed for your review today is a long-range financial planning tool, which gives us the ability to not forecast just over 1 or 2 years our costs, but it's designed to let us forecast what will 100 officers cost us in the next 20 years versus what are our anticipated revenues in the next 20 years based on typical recession cycles and typical increases in sales tax. There are assumptions that you build in, but it will give us both the numbers and also visualization, meaning graphs, to show us what those costs look like over time, that will help us answer that question. And so that's an element that's in this year's budget to give us that tool, to give us better information, by mid-year and next year, to be able to have that conversation meaningfully.
All right, thank you. And since the chief, I'll jump into public safety, if you don't mind, I have a question for the chief. So as we all know, we're sitting here watching the world burn in front of our eyes this past week. And I think you've made some excellent comments to the public, and I appreciate that. But moving forward, so I think there's a lot of room for improvements in our community policing, transparency, oversight. And I'm sure you're probably thinking of ways to improve the department in that area, trainings, et cetera. Is there anything, as we sit here today, that you need from this committee to move the department forward now in hindsight, after seeing what's happened this past week, and thoughts moving forward? Because we have this money to enhance public safety, and I think this is a topic on everyone's mind. And if there's something you need to help move the department in that fashion, as far as community policing and building trust with the community, I'm sure we'd love to hear that.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you very much for the question. The answer is yes. In terms of this budget, we are moving as rapidly as we can with 2 academies a year to increase our staffing. The variety of the positions being proposed here enables us to restructure the department, provide appropriate, responsible oversight at the supervisor, at the line level. It keeps us with a ratio of about 8 to 1. for our sergeants and line staff. It helps some of these positions are putting in management at command level so that we're having appropriate oversight and management of the valuable resources that we do have. This proposed budget positions us well to continue to meet the public safety needs of the community right now. And building upon what you're just saying, we are improving our community policing strategies and expanding that, but this budget, I feel confident saying, positions us to continue to build upon what we have and prepare us for the future.
And I think part of that is making sure we hire, the best,
Right.
cream of the crop. And I'm intrigued by the incentive program for hiring officers. And I've thought about this two ways. One would be, maybe a cash incentive, but also, is there a way we could do home ownership, down payment incentives for new officers to buy a home, put roots in the community, maybe even incentivize them to, buy in different types of communities through different cash incentives, and then it would be excusable after maybe 5 years. Once they put down roots in the community, I think we have a better chance of maybe keeping them around in the community and spreading them out and living throughout the community.
I appreciate your interest in helping us move forward. We're looking at a variety of strategies. Most specifically with the incentive, I'll turn it over to Christy Tinter from HR, because she has specifically been working on developing these proposals and is doing a lot of research across the country and across the state, certainly, to look at best practices and how we can do some of those unique things specifically to police recruitment.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, Christy Tinter, HR Director. Yes, we want to assess all opportunities in terms of incentives for police officers. We've been doing a lot of analysis in terms of what other incentive programs look like. We are seeing some emerging trends in terms of home ownership and helping to sponsor that. We've also focused on researching our current incumbents. So we recently have engaged in dialogue with those hired over the past 5 years to really understand better what brought you here, what keeps you here, what would make you recommend someone to come here. So we really want to monopolize on our current staff to understand what drives them. And in that, as a first step, recruitment bonuses, incentives, do see the most emerging of trends in terms of just when I finish a stage of a recruitment process or when I hire on and accept that offer, that there's a monetary component to that. Initial recommendations would most likely be to have a more simplistic program of that kind, but staff will definitely be open and continue to explore more community-based to really see how we can engage them to stay longer term and support other areas of business operations, such as purchasing homes in our community.
Is there a way we can incentivize at different levels if we can spread the officers out in the community? There's some neighborhoods, you drive around like in Rosedale and you see 4 or 5 police cars on one block, where they're all living together. Is there a way we can offer different levels? Is that legal? Is that a possibility to spread them out throughout the community? Because I think that helps in building trust in the community and, building up livable communities, I think. And
Definitely a placeholder that we can explore and see what opportunities are there as we first goal, develop and implement some programs and then refine it as we move forward.
Along those lines, how far along are you, do you think, in this research? Meaning, if the committee recommended and the council gave you money today to recruit new police officers, how quickly do you think you could come up with a program to do that, or give you money for incentives, I should say?
I don't want to shock the chief in saying ASAP, but I'm going to say ASAP. We started dialogue last fall, so we've had some very in-depth conversations about police innovation strategies as it pertains to recruitment. And it's looked at how we recruit trainees, how we bring them in, the timelines, the legal requirements of bringing those trainees in, base salary. So I've engaged with staff in a lot of research in terms of what are base salaries for trainees, what are the incentives that go along with those. We just concluded having the internal review of data coming back in from those hired in the last 5 years. So I believe that we would very expeditiously want to roll this out, and I would say that we would very much be pleased to roll this out with an upcoming academy setting. Again, anything that we can put out with our postings right now to say this is what we offer is definitely a benefit and moving in the right direction.
One other question. Chief, if I'm correct, basically people can only lateral in at the police officer level, patrolman level, correct? There are no lateral entries, detective, sergeant, things of that nature. Thank you.
That is correct.
Yes, Chief Terry, last week we met. It was the first time we've met since December, so congratulations on being named chief.
Thank you.
Sorry, now it's kind of a baptism by fire. My question regards the body-worn cameras. Last week we were told that the proposed allocation, $674,000, was for operating costs of the body-worn cameras. Looking back into the meetings from last year, we had the initial implementation was $500,000, and then in December we allocated another $800,000 for $1.3 million for body camera, the body camera program. Now we've got operating costs at $674. Is that ongoing? Is that something we can expect annually, $674? Because something that's 50% for an operating cost of $1.3 million just seems like a lot of money every year.
I have some information, but I'll let Chris go first.
Committee member through the chair, there are ongoing costs both related to the subscription for the cameras, I believe themselves, as well as for phones that are necessary to operate them. And so there's some ongoing costs for the cell carrier. So I would tell you that yes, there is going to be an ongoing cost. We accelerated this program pretty quickly to get the cameras in place. And so those capital dollars have been pretty much expended, I believe. And yes, there is an ongoing cost. It will be, it will be, in the magnitude of what we're talking about today. But I think from a staff perspective, and I'll defer to the chief on any comments he wants to make on this item, but that this investment was something that we heard directly from the community on, and we vetted those body cameras in this program over a considerable period of time. And so while I don't want to simplify it as the cost of doing business, it is in relationship to the benefit, I believe, that the community is receiving from these cameras.
And if I may, well, I'll let Chief respond initially, and then I have a few more thoughts.
Did Mr. Hewitt answer what you were looking for?
Partially. I'm trying to figure out if how much of that 674. Well, okay, so next year, is it still going to be 674 as an operating cost for the body cameras that we have, and is it going to be 674 roughly for the following year and for every year that we have it? See, a year ago, in the news, a lot of the concern about body-worn cameras was the cost. Some departments had started the project of body-worn cameras and then dropped them because of the expense of storage of terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of video. Mm-hmm. Chief Martin at the time said that the use of cloud computing and cloud storage was going to eliminate that as an expense, at least as a major expense. Now, there wasn't discussion then, because I guess we didn't think to ask, about the operating costs ongoing of something that once we buy it, we're going to be paying 50% of the purchase costs for each year just to maintain the program.
So we will have reached full body-worn camera deployment by the end of this fiscal year. Every officer in the department will have a body-worn camera. There are costs associated with the original equipment purchase and then the ongoing subscription for maintaining the system. It also requires a cell phone cost as well. That 674 includes that going forward, is the subscription for the body-worn camera, the maintenance of the equipment, the replacement of the equipment. It is all included in that, as well as the cell phone cost associated with the program.
As well as additional cameras for the 100 sworn officers we're going to be adding?
I don't have, I apologize, I don't have that detail in front of me, whether or not the 674, and I'll make an assumption here that it was taking into consideration the additional of the 29 officers going into this fiscal year, but yeah, it does.
And if I may, I'll also answer some of the asked questions, but also I think implied unasked questions. The ongoing costs for a service like this, it's very technology based. And so, again, this is a 21st century expectation and demand from the community, and there are 21st century implications with that. Anything that is technology based in our world today, you can expect a 3 to 5% increase on those contracts. I think those of you that are in business that use technology, technology costs increase. They just go up with the cost of doing business. So I don't want to be intransparent and promise that we're going to be at 674 every year. I think you're going to see incremental increases to the cost of doing business, to those costs, and it is an ongoing cost. I think to your point, Member Louie, that the cost of storage, when you think about how much video is being recorded so that we have that transparent information available, cloud computing helps. Review cycles to then allow that video that is no longer needed anymore past a certain retention schedule. That's helping. Body-worn cameras are still somewhat new, and so we're learning ways to try and be efficient and save costs on that. But I think to have that service available to the community, I think it is a fair expectation that it's going to be an expensive ongoing cost for this technology, and I think to expect that those costs will incrementally go up over time. And I think it's a great question. What will those costs be with another 2/3 of officers hired? I think that we'll see those go up as well in future years as we add the next complement of public safety officers. Oh, and I would just end by saying that, this is not something where the city's getting a bad deal. Every city across the nation is dealing with these types of costs to run these programs. As you pointed out, some have backed off some of the numbers of cameras that they've deployed, or how long their retention schedules are, that they wanted to be, have those held forever, but knowing how much that costs. This is a very typical cost for cities to deploy this type of service in today's world.
If I may, Madam Chair. Why, I do appreciate Mr. Clegg in regards to your background and experience as a business owner as well. My question would be in regards to new technology usually brings about also competition within certain industries. And within those competitions, it also allows the opportunities to obtain better pricing down the line. So my question would be, are we in a contract with this particular provider for an extended amount of time, whereas as new technology emerges and come forward, we can't look at other opportunities that may be out there in regards to these type of services?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, we did a year-long pilot project prior to going with this vendor where we tested, I think, 3 different companies. And after the performance issues, the quality of the technology, the ability to manage it, Axon was the best vendor. They are one of the leaders in the country. They are pretty widespread in the public safety technology. Our tasers that every officer carries is and will have the ability to be integrated into our Axon body-worn camera system. So it is an integration of across the board of some technologies within the department that we currently possess and use, and not just a body camera.
But Chief, could you clarify the term of the contract that we have currently?
I think it's 5 years.
And I would just comment that I think a 3 to 5 year window is fairly typical because you want to maximize the investment that you've made initially, but then give that 5-year mark an opportunity to go back out to market and compete it out and make sure we're still getting the best price.
And just one other follow-up for the chief as well. In regards to your request today, and maybe this is part of your annual budget and those costs are already absorbed, but I know recruitment is something that is a part of this and is very important. Also look at retention and the importance of retention as well, and the implementation of different programs such as with your current officers, for an example, psychological evaluations, continual training in regards to sensitivity issues as well. Now, these are ongoing in your department. As was asked earlier, is there sufficient enough in your budget to make sure that you have adequate exposure and training and programs for your existing officers?
Thank you for the question. All of those things are extremely important for our ability to meet the public safety demands and to ensure that the service that the officers provide when they get there are quality services. And so the answer to your question is yes. We have mandated training that we do that the state requires across the topics that you're talking about. And then we have ongoing training that we do as well. In our budget this year is a continuation, I think it's in the general fund, some wellness components that we are continuing. It was a program that we previously received grant funding for. It ends this year, and we are continuing with that program to address many of the issues that you're talking about on the wellness side.
Chief Terry, quick question on the capital items. Although a very small percentage of the overall budget and request, the $173,000 for the upgrade to the property room and the expansion or the briefing room. How do you see that being a direct impact? Is there an ROI that you can see, and does that directly impact? I guess I'm surprised that those types of things, after the large allocation of money last year towards the new training facility, would still keep coming, because I don't know that that was really the intent once we got through the training facility. It seems to me that those types of things should be coming out of a normal operating budget, not necessarily Measure End, which is focused on new officers, but maybe there's some clarification about how those two link.
So for the property room specifically, the upgrade is involving the HVAC system and an additional freezer. As our staff is increasing in the property room, it gets quite hot in the summer. And so there are some serious issues with the number of personnel that are working as our staffing levels are increasing within the property room. As we grow as a department, we're collecting more evidence. We need an additional freezer to store very sensitive evidentiary items, DNA, a variety of biological types of evidence that degrade very quickly if we don't have this freezer space. So as the organization is growing and we're seizing more evidence, this will increase our capacity to do that. With regard to the West Side substation, that was part of our longer-term look at as we increase in staffing, as we go towards more of a community-oriented policing deployment. This would allow us a better ability to remodel the West Side sub so that we could dispatch and respond or brief right out of that substation in a more effective way.
Today, you're not able to brief the West Side? It's all done downtown?
Well, that's correct. That is correct.
Okay.
Connie, did you have any comments on any of this?
No, I don't.
With that, can we dismiss the police chief? I know he has to get going.
I believe that we can, but if the committee wanted to actually take up a potential motion related to public safeties in anticipation of any possible questions that might come up as a motion is discussed, you could possibly do that now. And I would refer you to the second slide, and if we could get that second slide of the presentation back up. I don't know if I have the ability to do that. I've now just turned everything off. Oops, one more back. Yeah. we would make a recommendation that the committee would review this public safety piece as a motion, or alternatives that the committee may consider, and then I think we could release chief.
So Jeannie, do you recommend that we take it as 2 slides together? Or do you want to break them up?
Before,
I think, Madam Chair, that the one slide that the city manager has is for police and the second one is for fire. So if you're looking for the exact motion or suggestion for a motion, I would combine what Mr. Clegg is requesting and the last slide of the PowerPoint. And so it would be a motion that the proposals on the police department are consistent with the priorities of the measure.
And can we also leave that room after the motion and the second and the vote for anybody to leave extra comments for the record to be transferred to City Council?
Yes, I think that would be appropriate, especially for those committee members that voted no.
Okay, so for that first slide, Public Safety Police Department, I'll wait for a motion.
before we do that, I intend to make a motion that the committee recommend to the City Council that a dollar amount be appropriated for an incentive program for police officer hiring in this next budget year. So that is not in the proposals that are before us right now. So again, before we vote on an entire package, what I'd like to say is I'd like to see some dollar figure attached to this package for incentivizing hiring at the police department.
Thank you, committee member, and through the chair. You have pointed out that the dollar figure is not on this particular slide. The dollar figure we have proposed is $500,000. It shows up on a different slide because it's going to be funded through the Human Resources Department, but for police recruitment. And so, for purposes of the budget, we are recommending $500,000 as the incentive amount. Which motion that makes it into is, subject to the committee. We can work from there.
Okay, I guess I misunderstood. I thought the $500,000 was more about recruitment and expenditures in the area of recruitment, like going to job fairs and things of that nature. I didn't realize that it could be used for incentivizing bonuses.
Committee member and through the chair, appreciate the clarification, and sorry if there's been confusion there. If we were spending that much money just on recruitment, you would be able to come back to us with a lot of questions. So that was intended to be for incentives as well as some dollars to help with those recruitment fairs. But that large dollar amount is intended to largely be for incentives as well as some recruitment costs.
Mr. Rowland, I'm going to just stop you and I'm going to reopen it up to public comment. We had a speaker card request from Mr. Turnipseed.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. If we're going to open up recruitment, there's no funding for the people the laterals, correct, in this budget? Is there any money for we've talked about this, that I suggested because of our need to take $10 million and let's get the cops here now. That should hire about 40 cops, I think we agreed upon, to help meet the needs that we have in our community. And let's prioritize. Just because there are 13 priorities, all priorities on this list are not equal. And I think part of your duty is to prioritize what is the single most important thing and what is the least important thing. And I think most of us agree, and many of these items come under the auspices of the police department. And while I'm up here and I might not get a second bite under the fire department, the goal is specific: maintain a fully staffed and equipped. It didn't say expand, it didn't say grow, it didn't say make it a class 1, and yet 23 people last year, 13 more this year. We're having this budget creep transfer from the general fund to Measure N, And 2 or 3 years down the road, we're going to be going, where did the money go? And I think your committee needs to have that discussion of, as an oversight committee, what should be the 1 or 2, 3 priorities this community really has to be addressed. That's why you make the big bucks, and that's why you're sitting up there. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Did you have a comment?
I do have a comment, but I don't know that it needs to happen now. I think we should stay focused on the public safety, particularly slide 1, and move this forward if we are at a position, and then let the chief get back to work, and then we can have conversations about the balance. And maybe, to Mr. Rowland's point, maybe there could be a motion to approve the public safety under the police department, including the $500,000 under support services and non-departmental, and make that an approval, and then we can come back and have more detailed discussions about the other things, which my comments will be more relevant.
I agree, but I just have one very quick question. I think the city manager could answer this. If we were inclined to not recommend some of the things in later sections of this, and recommend, in fact, that the money that was allocated or requested in other sections be then appropriated to the police department for an increase in personnel over and above what is recommended by city staff or requested by the police chief himself, would now be the appropriate time to discuss that, or can we approve this request in and of itself, but yet later maybe come back and address the fact that we actually want more officers than you're asking for?
Committee member and through the chair, I would recommend taking this action initially. We could come back to the other question at another point in time. What I would say, and I've had this discussion with the chief of police and can speak to this, even if there was a desire to add more police positions in this next budget, we would be hard pressed to be able to fill and recruit all those positions. We've recommended the number of positions that we think we can get after in this next year. And then, we know we need to add additional officers in a subsequent year. The committee is welcome to discuss that and consider that, but we don't actually think we have much capacity to hire beyond what we've recommended for this current fiscal year, or coming fiscal year.
I'd like to make a motion that the Public Safety Police Department Phase 2, total proposed of $8.2 million, and the Police Department recruitment efforts under support services non-departmental, that those items are consistent with the guidelines under Measure N, and that this committee recommend approval to the City Council.
I'll second that motion. Tobias.
All right, any discussion? Yep. All in favor? We'll do roll call.
Chair Sanders?
Yes.
Vice Chair Hibbard? Yes. Committee Member Perez Andreessen?
Yes.
Holt?
Yes.
Keller?
Yes.
Louie?
Aye.
Prince?
Yes.
Rowland?
Yes.
And Tobias.
Aye.
The motion is unanimously approved.
Very well. Thank you for your time. All right, so now we will go to the second item, public safety for the fire department. If we can pull that slide back up. And I'll wait for any discussion.
So I would like to comment in general on the Measure N funds. As Mr. Turnipseed pointed out, this was largely a public safety measure when it came out. In fact, we had to be careful that it did not require a 2/3 vote because it was supposed to be so heavily weighted towards public safety. And two items came into that discussion. One was the growing homeless problem. At that time, it was emerging. it hadn't quite blossomed like it has today, that was a subset of public safety and also economic development, because many people in the community felt that the best police deterrent is a job. And so making some of the Measure N money available for economic development in a cohesive, consistent manner with other people who are already doing it in the community made a lot of sense. So I have an observation. It seems to me that our scope has gotten rather broad, meaning when we started, it was really clear that there were direct links between hiring 100 officers and the intent of the voters when they passed Measure N. Today, when I look at the balance of this, I'm seeing how you can get a line between the request and the objectives of Measure N, but sometimes that line is either squiggly or blurry or both. And it's not real clear why some of these things have found themselves in front of a Measure N committee that was committed to public safety. What was the sign out there? Measure N, a safer community, safer Bakersfield. And so just as a backdrop, maybe I'm the only one that thinks this, but it seems to me we've gotten rather broad, and that we should be coming right back down to public safety, public safety, public safety. So in my mind, it was 75% public safety, 10, 20% homeless and how those two overlap, 5 to 10% economic development, maybe 5% for the balance. And so I don't know where this huge budget has come from and the fixed costs that are associated with it and the creep that has occurred, but it seems like a lot of these things should all be based on normal budgets, not part of a Measure N, not part of what the voters were subscribing for. And so that's just my assessment on some of these items. I don't know how some of you, I know how some of you feel, I don't know how all of you feel, I guess, or I've kind of, Mr. Rowland, you were kind of indicating a little more focus on public safety in your last comment, but I think that that needs to be vented out. What are we here for? What did the voters put us here for? What was the intent when we started, and are we still on that intent?
Thank you, Barry. Does anybody else want to chime in?
I'll follow up on his comment just for a second. I agree with what Mr. Hibbert said, and I think what our problem is that the average taxpayer, when he voted yes on Measure N, and they typically don't vote for tax increases in this city, probably had in the back of his mind almost nothing but public safety and the homelessness issue. The other issues as to quality of life and economic development were minimal. What I'm seeing is a request for things like modifications of, briefing rooms and kitchens at the police department, fire department, and kitchen rehabs, air compressors, that kind of thing. I think those things should come out of the general fund. I don't think those are Measure N related items, and I don't think that any taxpayer out there thought of remodeling of kitchen at the fire department when they voted yes on Measure N. So it's going to be my recommendation that this committee deny those type of recommendations and focus on nothing but public safety with an emphasis on the police department.
Thank you, ma'am. I will be real quick here. Unfortunately, I don't have the ability to be able to determine what was in the mindset of every taxpayer when they voted on this measure. I do know that 50%, almost 50% of the members of this community did not vote for this measure. I also know that as we look at the importance of what was used to market this measure, it was public safety. But the community itself came together to determine the most important items. These were groups that came together to discuss what were the most important things that this community was facing. And it was the community that came up with 13 items. If public safety was the only item, then the community would have come up with only that one item. And so, although we know the importance of public safety, some of the people that I speak with as well, you know, they are concerned about the streets that they ride on every day. They are concerned to have a quality of life for their kids to be able to go to a park and enjoy nature, to enjoy this community as a whole, and have the recreation that's afforded to certain parts of the city that other parts of the city is not afforded to. So for them, that's important, and they voted as well. And so, again, we've listed 13 items. We can make a determination possibly of what's more important based upon the availability of funds. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to be a part of this committee, was to be involved in helping to make those determinations. And public safety, again, is important. And it was what was used to really push this measure to pass. But it wasn't the only thing that the public actually came together to discuss of what makes our community a great community, and the things and improvements that they wanted to see in our entire community as well.
Anybody else have any additional comments to Barry and Mr. Prince?
Yeah, I'll add to that. I tend generally to agree that public safety is, you know, an important part of the measure. Obviously, it's in the title, but there's also vital services, and I think, and a lot of those services are built and tied to public safety. And I think items such as economic development and enhancement to the communities, the parks, are an important part of that. I don't know if I'd agree exactly where we swing that pendulum as far as percentages. I don't know about that, but I think what's missing for me is when you get, you know, we're talking about public safety, it's easy for us. We're talking about, we're going to, you know, bring in 100 officers, that's great. Hiring incentives are great. But on the economic development side and enhancement side, I don't feel like we're moving the needle. I don't feel like, you know, we're getting a lot of like general park maintenance and things like that, trash enclosures. And I was kind of surprised we're not seeing bigger projects, bigger ideas that really enhance our community and make the community a better place to live, which would enhance the public safety, I believe. So that's just, those are my general comments.
I wasn't able to do this last week, but I just wanted to thank city staff for all the hard work that they put in. I think all in all, for one, I think you guys have done a good job kind of wrapping everything together in light of everything that's going on, and still maintain those big ticket items like Mr. Hibbard talked about, the public safety, homelessness, and those. And I would agree with Committee Member Prince in that I think we're all, I mean, that's why, a reason I think that this committee even exists is that we all kind of have our fingers in different parts of the community, right? I might not hang out with the same guys that Mr. Hibbard hangs out with, and so these conversations, that's, and no offense to Mr. Hibbard, but that's a good reason I think why we're here, to lay weight and put weight on kind of the priorities as they change, right? Hopefully homelessness isn't going to be an issue in the next few years, right? If we do our job, or, you know, things work out the way they're supposed to. And even the economic recovery is a good example in light of what's going on right now. The staff was able to shift to that part of it. That has become more important today than it was 3 or 4 months ago. I think everyone would agree with that. And so to me, if we're discussing kind of committee level and measure in priorities, I think that's part of our job, is to make sure everything is weighted properly, and with each of our little fingers in the community, and then also be able to be flexible and change as times change.
Madam Chair, thank you. Just 2 quick things. Thing one is I come back to, from my standpoint, the counseling session that we had with Mr. Tandy, given our initial directive as he kind of saw fit. And what I heard was a lot of, we get to challenge, ask questions, provide input and things along those lines, but we weren't necessarily crafting the ideas for what the city should be pushing forward with through the various departments. So those would be coming to us to act upon. we might be able to say this versus that, or ask some questions about the veracity of the funding events or things to that effect. The one concern that I do have is I was under the impression that we would see more, similar to Mr. Tobias and as well as Mr. Hibbert said, more along larger project-based activities as opposed to consistent growing in terms of the salaries and the expenses of the operations itself. So the concern that I've got is going forward, if we continue to fund the positions that are being crafted or being asked about over time, if we're going to be using the funds from Measure N specifically for staffing and the funding for that staffing, we're going to be eating up this $60 million, $70 million a year with additional staffing costs without the additional ability for those types of major projects that would come around for vital services or public safety as well. So that's a question I have going forward.
I was going to say this for later on one of the other items, but to that point, my thought is that those big ticket items early on, the increase or response time from police, you can't do that without hiring more officers, and you can't hire more officers without having incurred costs. So I mean, I get same thing with the homeless center. You can't build a homeless center and not fund how you run it. You know, that was another cost that was in there. So my question would be is, just because they start out as Measure N at one, how long do they stay on our books? So 20 years from now, anybody that got hired on in the year 2020 is still going to be counted against Measure N? I mean, at some point, I mean, cities expand, and so if you say, oh, look, we got Measure N, so we're going to do all police expansion out of Measure N. Well, if Measure N didn't pass, I would hope that the police department would have expanded anyways to keep up with the need. I mean, government, it's needs-based, right? And so there's got to be a better way of accounting if this is all this is accounting, because it all goes into the general fund. I mean, it's still a sales tax, it's still the city's money, and really Measure N is just what bucket we're putting it in. Like, how long does it stay in our bucket, and can we get it off our books so we can do some of the capital improvements and other things, you know, years down the road? Because we will get to a point to where we're done. You know, everybody that we hired 10 years ago is taking up our budget.
Mrs. Perez Andreessen, do you have any additional comments?
Not at this time.
I just wanted to add such good dialogue. Good points are all made. I will just piggyback onto everybody else's comments and only mention some points that haven't been mentioned in just this recent dialogue. I strongly believe that if we were not in the current situation that we're in as a city and as a nation, that we wouldn't be having this extra dialogue here. I really don't. The times are uncertain. Every week there's something different. To where I agree with Mr. Prince on his comments, to where, you know, friends are also mentioning how important it is for families to have access. We don't even know if we will have access, you know, this calendar year. We're halfway through this calendar year at this point. And when I look at recreation and parks, where I feel like the first bullet point, beach park, skate park, that I do think it is a safety issue. Falls under the public safety. The Patriots Park access improvement, that falls under safety, public safety. Maybe some of these improvements along, you know, other line items, if there was a way that we could pull out, at least just for, and this is again just dialogue and amongst my committee members, would you all feel comfortable, you know, going down that avenue? It sounds like everyone is emphasizing public safety, and I think there's a way of seeing what that public safety is throughout these bullet points. Or do we continue down this road of, you know, line item by line item and just hearing the feedback? I would just like to know where the committee, it just seems like we've all, in this last 5 minutes, thrown out a lot of different ideas and opinions, and what would you all be comfortable doing next?
Madam Chair, if I may make a comment and some recommendations?
Yes.
So I appreciate the dialogue from the committee. As I spoke with each of you individually in advance of this meeting, absent Ms. Perez, that I could sense the committee, continuing to feel out a little bit the role of the committee, and it is a very distinct and defined role. Yet I have still invited the committee to provide feedback and general comments and general suggestions to the city staff, because I think there's value in that democratic process. There's value in hearing what you hear and hearing what you care about. I would remind the committee that there is a very distinct role in responding to staff recommendations to determine if they meet the 13 criteria or not. But let me add a few other comments, and I have a recommendation about how to move forward. So, larger projects, just really quickly. Because, again, it is an uncertain year, staff did not want to bring forward too many really big ticket items because we want to be cautious and have that contingency bucket of projects that could move forward if we're okay and that wouldn't move forward if we're not. Also, we heard in feedback in preparing our budgets that we had a few pretty big ticket items in the initial year, and we were looking to have a little more focus in our neighborhoods and some of those issues around quality of life in neighborhoods, and that's how we approached the issue on projects. From a staffing perspective, I won't do this many times, but this is the one time with this group that I will say, as a new person coming into this organization, if you'd like some objective feedback about where Bakersfield is at from somebody who's a professional in the field coming into this organization, the city of Bakersfield has been on very, very meager resources for a very long time. And to the point of Member Holt saying, doesn't government typically grow, from other revenue sources and, grow out? One of the realities for the city of Bakersfield is that for more than a decade, the population grew and the service demands grew and budgets reduced and no new resources were available. So this is a community asking for more when there's no additional resources for staff and for council to deploy them in those, strategic and new ways. I think one of the realities that this community started facing, and in some of my conversations with Mr. Turnipseed about this, is that I think there was a recognition that the city did not have the ability to do these things that are desired, and in fact the city did not have the ability to even maintain some of the existing services that had been in place because the community grew while resources were challenged. So probably nobody likes to hear the new guy come and say, the city didn't have enough money to do the right things, and so the only way to do those is through Measure N. But I think that's part of the reality that this community faces, is that I think there's a hope and a desire that Measure N only gets spent on new exciting stuff. The reality is this community did not have the resources to even continue to provide the most important services into perpetuity. Part of being able to grow city services is being able to grow the resources that are available. I applaud former administrations in this community for being very frugal and for being very wise in how they spent those dollars, but not changing really the core tax base for a really long period of time and expecting to continue to have those same services grow over time is inconsistent, frankly. Now, that being said, of course, Measure N has a key deliverable, and that is public safety. With that, homelessness. Economic development and quality of life, as identified, were part of those 13 priorities that the community identified. I absolutely have heard it to the extent that I feel it in my bones, the importance of protecting these Measure N dollars. I get it, totally get it. And that's why we're very careful in bringing forward our recommendations to this group. But Measure N was not necessarily designed only to do new things. It was designed to restore the ability of the city to do some things as well as continue to build out public safety and address these big ticket items. So with that, I would just, express that the feedback that we hear about this dilemma of we want to make sure we're spending the money wisely, we're spending it on innovations and things that are going to have a return on that investment and on the most important priorities, absolutely, I hear all of that. The reality is for, let's talk about new officers. To shift new officers from the PSVS measure over to the general fund didn't have funds to expand officers before Measure N. It's going to be, pretty incremental, the increases to the general fund, and so the general fund wouldn't be able to take over vast numbers of officers. We do hope to grow out city services from the general fund as general fund revenues increase over future years, and I've heard very clearly that the PSVS is not designed to fill all those general fund positions we've had in the past, and that's not what we're going to do. We are maintaining all of those general funded positions and services, but there's very little ability to continue to expand general funded activities because that revenue base is what it's been for a long time, and it sees maybe a 2 to 4% increase on any given year in new revenues, just based on how the economy moves. But the reality is that in this coming year, we're seeing a 10% reduction instead of a 2 to 4% increase. And so on the general fund side, we're cutting. But in future years, we'll grow that as we can, that 2 to 4%. But the city made a bold move, the community made a bold move and said, we need more than a 2 to 4% growth. We need a big growth in our ability to tackle big problems, and that's what Measure N is about, is saying we're gonna make that bold move and say we're gonna improve the outcome faster than we can just with these small incremental changes. So those are a few of my broad observations about Measure N, just to help you hear, where I'm at on it, and I absolutely have been listening to members of the community and members of the council, and in particular members of this oversight committee, about what is important and matters to you. With that in mind, my recommendation would be that you can take up each of the recommendations from staff on the slides that are before you. And some of those you may deem as related to public safety, and some you may not, per what you're suggesting, Chair. And you can work through those recommendations. And I think, again, it was a good conversation to have the committee members share where they're at on this topic. I would think that it is important to move through each of these recommendations to see where folks are at on them. And then at the end, it is still another opportunity to then summarize additional general feedback from the committee that we can pass on to the City Council.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Mr. Clegg. So let's continue with that recommendation. I will open up the committee for a motion on public safety for the fire department as proposed on this slide.
I'll make that motion.
Who was that? Mitchell?
Second.
What?
I made the motion that they comply with the requirements.
All those in favor?
Would you mind repeating the motion, please?
The motion is that the measures under the fire department comply with the requirements as deemed by the PSVS alignment. Is that correct? Or is that?
I was just asking for the record.
Okay.
And who was the second?
Holt.
Oh, Holt was.
Do we have discussion now that we have a motion in a second?
Yeah.
I had a question for Mr. Clegg or Mr. Hewitt. If you could just explain the contingent projects. So they are proposed, but will not be started prior to January 2021 to allow additional revenue data to be received. If the additional revenue is not received, what's the status of all those contingent dollars? Or how are those prioritized, since there's a lot of dollars, $7.24 million in there?
Appreciate the question, Member Louie. If revenues are not realized, those projects will be postponed. If some of those revenues are realized and not others, I think to your point, then that's a time at mid-year we would come back to this body and say, here's the 6 out of 12 that we think we do have money to move forward on, but the rest, will just be postponed.
In the event there's more than, there's less revenue received than anticipated for the contingency, if it's 7.24, but we realize $9 million less, then what happens?
So that is a possibility, and the first step that I would take is, again, we're recommending that any unexpended PSVS dollars from the current fiscal year be held in a contingency, and those would be available to offset additional, revenue loss that we didn't anticipate before it would impact the current fiscal year.
So continuing that thought, we have money set aside for reserves, 9.5 million in this proposal. Now we have a sub-account that's contingent, that's unexpended, in addition to the 9.5 and in addition to the 12 million or 13 million we set aside last year?
Correct, and out of an abundance of caution, we're wanting to have several contingent buckets because the economy's uncertain enough. We want to be very careful.
But the unexpended allocations from last year, let's say, you said set aside for unexpected things, would the city then use, say, a specific project that the committee and the council had recommended last year and use those monies to meet general obligations?
So it is a general contingency. It could be used for loss of revenue to PSVS. I stated at the last meeting that if we got to a point where we thought we would have to lay off general fund employees outside of PSVS, that we would come back to this group and say, is that a decision we want to make, or do we use the contingency? So I do want to be transparent about that, that we would hold that as a contingency for other possible things that could happen given where we're at with the economy. Because the absent that contingency, that is the next step in our capital improvement plan, in our general fund. We've cut as far as we can, and the next step is to reduce projects, reduce employees, reduce programs, and so we would come back to this group with recommendations about that contingency fund, depending on what we might face in the coming year.
Of course, we're still in comment.
Okay. Everybody likes firemen. I understand that. But at the same time, we've already reached a level 2 status, in fact, improved our level 2 status that the fire department was insisted upon last year that we maintain or improve. I don't deny that these positions of captains and firefighters might be needed at some point in the future. But a $1.8 million expenditure for staffing right now, I don't think it's the time to do it. And I'm just telling my fellow committee members I am not going to vote in favor of fire department staffing at this time.
Thank you. Mr. Prince, did you have a comment?
Yes, and this would just be for clarification purposes. Mrs. Gennaro, in our vote, and as you indicated earlier, we're here to actually provide a vote based upon the fact that whether or not any of these recommendations fall within those 13 categories, correct? And well, I'll let you answer that question first.
Committee Member Prince, that is correct. And in fact, if you don't mind, I'll read from the resolution that the council passed. It says specifically that the committee shall provide independent verification that the revenues collected pursuant to the measure are expended in such a manner that it is consistent with the projects, programs, and services described within the measure.
Okay, and just as a follow-up question, in regards to providing that vote, and I will use the police department as an example. If they were requesting 30 new vehicles, and personally I felt as if they only needed 5, okay, then my vote still would be the fact that the 30 did qualify upon one of the 13, and so I would still be voting yes on that, but also then I would make recommendations after the vote is cast to the council to say my opinion is that it does qualify, but instead of 30 vehicles, I would suggest only 5.
That is my understanding, correct?
Thank you.
Dialogue. We do have a motion and a second, so we will open for a vote. And then after the vote, whether it passes or fails, we'll open up for comment for the record.
Do we need to allow the public to speak on this item, or?
We typically and have had the public statements at the beginning of the meeting.
Go ahead, Mr. Turnipseed. You are always welcome at the podium.
If they've already voted, then I wouldn't want to do it. I think the one thing isn't the 13 points, because everything the city does is in those 13 points. What you have to say is that point number 2 of improving responses has a priority over number 9. That's part of being a recommendation. We're not arguing the facts that these aren't going to city things, but these are staff wants versus community needs. You're here to advise them, well, we think the community needs are this, not just keeping staff and adding new toys. Part of the thing we should have talked about, we've talked about in the past, is a transition to a technology in our city. We don't have enough technology. We're still pushing paper. We're still hiring clerks. We don't need to be hiring clerks. We need to be buying technology. We've talked about that, but that's not here today. If you said we could say, gee, we could eliminate 10 clerks if we spent $5 million on technology, that's a good deal. Those are the kind of discussions we should be having, not the idea that and it's very specific on fire, maintaining a fully equipped Class 2 staff. It didn't say grow it to top Tier 1. It didn't say we want 85 this year and 87 next year and 90 the year after that. We have limitations. And the discussion here, as Mr. Hibbert talked about, our Measure N money is only going to go so far. And if you keep adding ongoing expenses like employees, there aren't going to be any money for your $5 million technology program. That's the decision we need to be making now and not 3 years from now when there's no money. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you have a comment?
I was going to ask, could we ask the fire chief to say why this is needed to maintain level 2?
Sure.
Madam Chair, committee, first I want to thank you for your commitment. Anthony Galageza, your fire chief. Just to give a quick understanding of Class 2, it's broken down into 50% for fire department, 40% for water supply, and 10% for dispatch. To understand, last year, your vote allowed us 2 additional dispatchers who had increased in 176% in call volume in the past 10 years prior to that. That being said, we added 2 dispatchers. That increased by 1.5% to 2% on our ISO. As far as the 50%, it's based on fire. It's based on our stations. It's based on our rigs, not always necessarily the manpower. The other side is the 40% water supply. We have a great water supply system within this city. We really do within the city limits. So that being said, we are proud of our Class 2, but we're proud because it helps business. To also understand some history of the Bakersfield Fire Department, in 2004, that was the last time we increased staffing. That was for fire station number 15, where you see the memorial at this point. That was 2004. In 2004, when we were able to get that station, we did increase manpower to staff that station. Fast forward towards the recession, we took away 2 of the type 3s. Those are the brush engines, the ones that you allotted last time. And we took away 4 of those at that time because we had to fill certain spots. We took away a deputy chief. We took away arson investigators. Prior to that, we had 4 arson investigators and 1 fire marshal. Moved forward to 2008, we had 2,012 employees, 2008. We currently have 2008, we had 212 employees. Move forward to now, 2020. Because of the vote last year, we are 1 down from that, from 2008 levels. That also being said, to address Mr. Turnipseed's, what he had stated, we also got rid of the other 2 Type 3 engines in 2011 to staff Station 14, dropped us even more. Further, we talk about we want to maintain the Class 2. We do. I mean, I'd love to be Class 1, but you'd have to build 6, 7 fire stations, and that's an impossibility. To maintain Class 2 is one thing. But the problem is Bakersfield has not maintained the population we had in 2004. It's not maintained the call volume that we had in 2004 when we built Fire Station 15. In the last 6 years, we've increased just medical aids, emergency medical service calls. We've increased 33%. These rescue units will help protect the city. Mr. Liu, I have to apologize. Last time you had asked about response times, and I don't feel that I was deficient in my answer, not giving you a complete answer, because there's more to it, and it's because of that history. That's the issue. Those rescue units that we're asking to place in the core of the city is because we cannot just plunk a fire station and a new fire engine. We're asking for the best cost measure for what's best for the citizens of Bakersfield. They will be a 2-in, 2-out, which will cover our OSHA requirements for firefighter safety. But more importantly, we will protect the citizens of Bakersfield by running them in a fast response unit out of the busiest firehouses in the city, because we can't cover those other stations. When Fire Station 6, Union and Brundage, they go on a call, an EMS call. Fire Station 2 has to come from East 21st and Baker and respond. Those two areas are now naked without fire protection, EMS. That's why our response times have not decreased. We've been able to keep up as best we can. But I guarantee you, with these rescue units and the increases that we're asking for, and the individuals we're asking for, and the units we're asking for, that's what we're trying to achieve. What is best for the citizens of Bakersfield? So to make you understand that history, we have decreased over that amount of time. And we are not maintaining. We may be maintaining a Class 2, but that's because your recommendation go forward and get our emergency dispatchers that had 176% added to them percentage-wise over an 8 to 10 year period. But now we really need to affect those response times. And that will allow us to maintain and actually start moving forward and assisting the citizens of Bakersfield, going from 10 years ago of 27,000 calls a year to now 43,000 calls a year with the same people. Thank you.
Do we have a motion? We don't have a motion. We do. We have a motion. If there's no further discussion, we will go ahead and open for a vote. By roll call, please.
Chair Sanders?
No.
Vice Chair Hibbard?
No.
Committee Member Perez Andreessen,
No.
Holt,
Aye.
Keller,
Aye.
Louis,
Aye.
Prince,
Aye.
Roland,
No.
and Tobias.
Aye. Aye.
The motion passes. I'm going to go ahead and open up for anybody to make that extra comment on their nose, starting with Mr. Hibbard.
I voted no largely because I don't see the nexus between remodeling kitchens and bathrooms and maintaining the level 2. I think it was in a presentation that you made last year, or last week, rather, that some of the kitchens are 25 years old. Lots of kitchens are 25 years old. And I just don't see using taxpayer dollars to maintain something where you have people who are there that have time that can adequately maintain things. If you need a new oven, you need a new oven. But we don't need a $250,000 remodel. And I feel as though this is part of the creep that we have to be very careful of. Scope creep. If it is truly for technicians or dispatchers or equipment, yes. I also would like to see at a future presentation, we keep using this 2008 level as a benchmark. But unfortunately, I have no idea if that was an efficient fire system team that worked at that time, if it was overstaffed by 20%, if it was understaffed by 20%. I have no idea what it was in 2008. So to use that as a benchmark, I'm just at a disadvantage because I don't know what that means. My perception, although possibly incorrect, is that there's a lot of waste in fire departments. That may be unfair. That's largely due to your colleagues at the county. But that's what I anticipate, that there's a lot of waste if we really peel back the onion. And I don't think that these are consistent with the measure number 8, which is maintain a fully staffed and equipped Class 2 fire-rated department.
Thank you, Mr. Hibbard. Mr. Rowland? No comment. The other no was,
Perez Andreessen,
do you have
Yeah, I
any?
just wanted to just add that I voted no because I see in the next section for homelessness that we have 4.3 as a contingent expense to be deferred until next year. And since the fire department is a level 2 fire department, I just think the city council should consider allocating that $3 million to the homelessness section.
motion was approved with Sanders, Hibbard, Perez Andreessen, and Roland voting no.
Thank you. We will go to the next slide. If you could pull that up, homelessness.
Madam Chair, I want to make an announcement that I'm going to abstain from this item out of an abundance of caution. The company I work for operates the County Navigation Center, which is included in the funding recommendation. And we also would consider applying for affordable housing dollars, so I'm going to abstain. Do I need to leave the room, Madam Attorney? Okay.
So I'll wait for a motion for this slide.
I'll make a motion that the homelessness slide are consistent with the spending priorities of the ballot measure and make a recommendation to City Council.
Is there a
I'll
second?
second.
Oh, go ahead. Connie will
I'll-
second. Any discussion? Seeing none, we will open up for a vote.
Chair Sanders,
Yes.
Vice Chair Hibbard,
Yes.
Perez Andreessen,
Yes.
Holt,
Yes.
Keller,
Yes.
Louis,
Aye.
Prince,
Yes.
Roland.
Yes.
Motion is approved with Committee Member Tobias abstaining.
Thank you. We will now go to fiscal stability.
I will make the motion that this complies with the requirements under the Measure N ballot and be pushed to the council.
I'll second the motion.
That was Mr. Rowland. Sure, we'll open up for discussion.
We call this the rainy day fund, I think, in other meetings. So my question is once we put it in the bank, when we pull it out, does it have to be Measure N? Or does it, if it stays in the bank for a year, then it can go to any general fund item?
So I'll ask Mr. Hewitt to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the PSVS revenues or general fund revenues, although we've targeted those specific to separate review and approval by this group, we've also agreed to have a separate agreed upon procedures review of those revenues as outlined by our finance director last meeting. But the reserve fund is a general reserve fund. But beyond that, I'll let Mr. Hewitt respond.
Committee members, quickly, as you recall last year, in what's built into the ordinance is a requirement that we account for dollars related to Measure N separately. So with that being said, any amount that's put into a reserve from Measure N dollars is separate from any other reserve the city has. In terms of utilizing that reserve fund, it would require a review by the committee and then action by the council. And the use of that reserve funding would be dependent on the circumstances moving forward. It's there as a rainy day fund. It's there in part because this committee recommended last year that the city work towards building a 60-day reserve fund in light of, frankly, where we're headed theoretically in the next 6 months. So I don't have, and I'm not saying we're going to be utilizing the reserve fund. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But what I am saying is that the use of the money at some point in time when reserves need to be utilized, and we hope we don't get there because we've got 3 other fiscal buffers built into this, will be made through a recommendation from staff, through this committee, and then on to the council.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I have a question. Just for clarification, it says on the slide reserve/contingency, but this is the full 9.5 million is the amount that this committee and the council kind of put a plan together last year for augmenting the reserves. This doesn't include the contingency projects we talked about under each item, right?
No, it does not, but I will clarify, and Mr. McKeegan can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the plan that has been adopted calls for about $8.8 million to meet that 60-day reserve. Next year, we would have to deposit about $8.8 million into the reserve. And so this plan encompasses that, and then there's a component that again falls back to the contingency line item that again is a buffer for, again, unanticipated future adjustments or downturns in revenue further than what we've already projected. So 9.5 minus 8.8 gets us to a net amount that would be left in that contingency pool.
Mr. Yacht, one other real quick question, I apologize. On your slide that shows the distribution of the allocations by line item,
yes.
Where's the 9.5 million within that allocation? I see 9.563 under non-departmental contingency. Is it included in that plus another 63 for something else?
Yes, so I think you're referring to this slide right here. The contingency, so non-departmental includes $968,000 for next fiscal year. Again, this is phase 1 and phase 2. So a lot of what this is including is those CalVIP positions and a few other non-departmental costs that are related to some of the council initiatives and organizational initiatives that are accounted for in the non-departmental line item because they're not attributable to one department or another. But below that, you're going to see the 9.563, and I think that's essentially a rounding. It's a rounding item, so that's kind of the exact dollar amount. We used 9.5 million as kind of the round number, 9.563.
Thank you.
To answer your question.
Don't sit down yet. I have a question. For those of us number geeks who might actually care about this and want to see it, the funds these funds will be put into a sub-account of the reserves. That's the fund, if I remember right, Fund 91 or something?
19.
19, okay, dyslexic. Okay, and then as a follow-up to that, when we initially, at the very first meeting, when we set aside $12 million or so, part of that, putting the money in the funds was going to allow us to make the one-time payments for the CalPERS and save $8.7 million over the next 7 years or something like that. Have we made that first payment, lump sum, and where are we with that?
Yes. So the action you took last year to put that money away and essentially pay that CalPERS payment up front has resulted in probably in about $1 million savings in the current year. We have paid that up front to save the 7.25% interest charge that CalPERS otherwise charges the city monthly. So you have saved about $1 million through that action. And then over the course of the year, I believe that savings is then deposited back into the reserve and accounted for within the plan based upon our discussion last year. So that's all in the works, and that has been done, and I can confirm that payment has been made.
We will go ahead and open up for voting.
Chair Sanders,
Yes.
Vice Chair Hibbard,
Yes.
Committee Members Perez Andreessen,
Yes.
Holt,
Yes.
Keller,
Yes.
Louie,
Aye.
Prince,
Yes.
Roland,
Yes.
and Tobias.
Aye.
Motion is unanimously approved.
Thank you. Next up is the economic recovery. We'll wait for a motion, sorry.
I'll make a motion that the economic recovery is consistent with the spending priorities of the ballot and make a recommendation to the city council.
Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Keller. And we will open up for discussion.
So the 1.5 million for the Back to Work Clean City Initiative, I just want to make sure I got it right on the 3-hour YouTube video I got to watch this week. So is that one that we talked about possibly contracting out with the Bakersfield Homeless Center for that, as long as it doesn't intrude on some of the bargaining units that we already have doing that type work?
Yeah, Committee Member Holden, through the chair, it is work that we would anticipate be contract work. Because it's a dollar amount that is significant, we anticipated, having a competitive RFP process for that. We anticipate that, individuals like the Homeless Center that have like programs would compete well in that. But it actually might give us the opportunity to have more than one vendor. You might have 2 or 3 different contractors that could have zones that would be able to address this citywide. There's an existing contract that's limited to some targeted areas, and this would really let us get at trash and litter removal citywide.
Yeah, I just wanted to go on record to show my support on anywhere we can utilize a program like that, because that is definitely part of the piece of the big puzzle of homelessness. Thank you.
Thank you. Any others?
Yes, please. Could you also give me just a brief explanation when it comes to the business assistance, the build-out business incentive tools?
Yeah, thanks, committee member, and through the chair. This is, and I appreciate the question because it's sort of an amorphous number without a lot of details, and I appreciate that. Because we're creating a new economic and community development department, we're going to rely on that department as well as our economic development strategy, which the City Council has authorized an economic development strategy to take place, and we're going to be doing that work in probably the next 6 months. Both of those would be tools to further define what are the details of what those incentives are and how much the amounts should be. in each of those pots, but let me give some examples that are very typical in cities. So this would be the ability for a business on Baker Street to apply for a facade improvement loan, and that might be $25,000, $30,000. It might be less if it's a smaller business. And then that could be a loan that gets paid back over time entirely or in portions, and some forgivable portions. But that would be an economic development incentive tool to help our local businesses either expand, to bring in new businesses, or to retain businesses. Another example is a Lien Forgiveness program. You have that property on the corner that has been a chronic nuisance, and it can't turn over because there's so many liens on the tax roll that nobody can buy it to make it pencil. Well, you know, we do want to hold folks accountable, but at the same rate, we want to get that back to productive use as a property. And this might be a program where under a council action, they could approve a lien forgiveness for that property as a redevelopment tool to help get it back on the market. Other examples could include entrepreneurship grants. Many cities will have a bucket of maybe $50,000 to $100,000 each year that they give away 5 entrepreneurship grants to small businesses trying to start a kitchen incubator or trying to start some kind of other service. Another example might be different communities use funds like these to start the farm to fork movement, but you need a little bit of seed money, and so this could be used as that. So we do need to define each of the tools that we're going to use and say how much we're going to budget for each of those tools, but overall this funding is intended to create that toolkit of incentives that our economic development team would be able to use to help businesses do more business in the city.
Thank you for the explanation. And Madam Chair, in that regards, I would like to recuse myself in regards to making a vote just in case, for any reason, personally or my business falls within any of those categories.
Fine.
Not the nuisance properties or anything, but in the other items listed based upon the discussion today.
Thank you, Mr. Prince. Go ahead, Mr. Louie.
This is for city manager, I guess. What is the Bakersfield City contribution to the current Economic Development Corporation?
Currently, we do not have a contract with the KEDC. We have a very minimal contribution as a sort of regional contributor. I'd have to rely on Mr. Hewitt, perhaps, or Ms. Kitchen to give the exact number, but it's actually nominal in comparison to the county that has a contractual deliverable agreement with them that the city does not at this time.
The city's current annual contribution to KDC is $2,500.
So, looking at the proposal of 5 additional positions, creating a standalone economic and community development department, I guess the question would be, if we spent less money and put it toward the current EDC, would we need our own standalone department? Reason for that question is, even though it is called the Kern Economic Development Corporation, I think there's a feeling out in Arvin and Wasco and Buttonwillow that most of the improvements and most of the business that comes in is located in Bakersfield.
So a couple of different thoughts. It's an economic and community development department, and I believe that I walked a little bit through this last meeting, and so I'll try not to spend too much time on it. But this department would have a number of different divisions. One would be our Homelessness Division. So homelessness right now is being addressed sort of as a citywide partnership task force, but this would identify a distinct owner for the issue of homelessness to continue to drive that issue and manage that issue. It also, the Housing and Urban Development Department funding streams, our CDBG dollars, our ESG dollars, and our home dollars. Those are currently going through the Economic and Community Development Division in Development Services. And so the staff that move over from Development Services into this department will continue to manage those housing and shelter and CDBG dollars. At the same time, we are looking to have our Visitors and Convention Bureau and our arena operations managed under this same department because we see a lot of synergies between those and economic development. So the fourth branch of this department is the straight economic development as opposed to community development and homelessness. And that economic development team is going to be pretty small, frankly. I think when we talk about a department that's going to be about, I think it's going to be about 18 individuals. So it'll be 18 individuals total. There will be about 4 or 5 working only on economic development, and the rest will be working on these other areas that are related to economic and community development. So a typical economic development department in most cities will have 3 different buckets. We're actually going to have 4 because we're working hard on homelessness. But most departments will have a team that is responsible for sort of that affordable housing piece. They'll have economic development that supports local businesses and local economic development, and then a team that kind of goes out and tries to recruit big companies. So the function of most economic development corporations in most counties is similar to the way KEDC works here. Their job is to go out and recruit big-time anchor companies to come to this region. Whereas most cities manage a little bit more the local economic development, redevelopment of urban cores, trying to provide some of these business incentives to expand some of our local businesses. But the KEDC's role is largely one of going after really big new job generation. And so I appreciate the question because we've actually been in conversations with the county, chamber, KEDC about roles and responsibilities and, you know, who does it make sense to be doing what. I think there's still going to be a role for the city to provide economic development on a local basis for our local businesses. What I would envision is that we could assign a member of our team to be part of a team with the county, the chamber, and KEDC to really be that team that goes out and really pushes hard to get these anchor job generators, and that we would, you know, I would even be willing to assign somebody from our staff to be on that team to help them in that effort, but it is distinct from what the other city operations would be doing. And I would suggest KEDC's, you know, they're suited to that and they've been doing that, and I think it makes sense to support them, and that may be an item and a topic that comes up in the future about, do we look at a different contractual relationship with KEDC? We wanted to start with this department being established, the partnerships we're looking at with the county and others, and again, each of us playing our important role, but then teaming together to make sure we're going after, you know, getting more job generators here in this region.
Thank you. And since you mentioned one of the buckets was going to be homelessness, so the motion that we, a while ago, approved $10.3 million for homelessness, the capital projects, the $1.9 million for the navigation center, affordable housing, $3 million. The administration of that, will that fall under this department, or is there a separate department? And if this is not yet created, because we're just voting on it now, who's administering that $10.3 million that we approved?
The answer is that $10.3 million will be administered by the Economic and Community Development Department. If that's not approved by the City Council ultimately through the budget process, that would fall to our Economic and Community Development Division as it exists today. Again, it's not as staffed as the department would be, and again, it addresses, just for perspective, 4 of the 8 City Council priority goals fall within this bucket of the economic and community development. And so that's another reason why I've said, as a city manager, we need to elevate the capacity of that team and have it report directly to the city manager's office so we can push 4 of our 8 city council goals. If not approved, that would remain a responsibility of that division. That division actually manages $35 million in state and federal funds that come through for affordable housing and homelessness, you know, in the current fiscal year. And so, again, this would be, additional resources to that team. We want to create a strong team that can deploy those well.
Thank you.
You mentioned that 18 people will be in this department, and how many currently exist that are on the general fund, and how many, are all 18 going to come out of Measure N money?
There are 14 that are general funded positions. Well, and there may be a mix of funds. Some of them are funded through administrative costs to those federal and state grants, but there are 14 existing positions. There are 2 positions that this committee reviewed in February to add to that division. One is a GIS technician, and the other is an accounting clerk that this group reviewed in your February meeting. We're proposing adding a homelessness principal planner to manage all of the homelessness issues, and a business manager, just given that portfolio of issues and finances that this department would be managing. We're proposing those 2 additional positions, so there would be 4 positions funded by PSVS and 14 funded from other sources.
Thank you.
We'll go ahead and open for voting.
Chair Sanders,
Yes.
Vice Chair Hibbard,
Yes.
Committee Members Perez Andreessen,
Yes.
Holt,
Yes.
Keller,
Yes.
Louie,
Aye.
Roland,
Yes.
and Tobias.
Aye.
Motion is approved with Committee Member Prince abstaining.
City Council and Organization Initiatives. We will wait for a motion.
I have a question for the city manager. Can you quickly just sum up for us what citywide beautification efforts encompasses?
Are you referring to the 1.4? These are the gateway improvements that we talked about at our last meeting to improve entryways in the hardscapes of the entryways.
Madam Chair, I'll make the motion that this measure is consistent with the goals outlined in Measure N.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Any discussion?
I have a question.
Sure.
So we've talked about recurring costs or ongoing costs. So like the legislative advocacy, or I think that was the assistant to the business manager or to the city manager. I've seen elsewhere where we prorated, where things were, certain times were spent on Measure N and they might do some other general fund type stuff. So is there a reason why this one isn't? I mean, is this person going to be strictly doing Measure N priorities?
That's a good question, and frankly, we did not consider a funding split on this, just to be transparent. The things that this individual will be working on will be the city council priority goals, and so it will be largely around advocacy, but towards homelessness and new funding grant related, as well as public safety. And I think their work will largely be reflective of the 13 areas, but we didn't, like I said, we didn't look at a funding split for that one. If I could actually answer a question that was somewhat implied, but that wasn't explicit there, is that the legislative advocate, that would be a contract for someone to help represent the city in Sacramento. And that would be something that we would, probably do on an annual basis. The risk assessment, the long-range financial planning, and employee management software, those are one-time costs. The risk assessment may come back with some recommendations about some efficiencies projects and other things for the city to improve. that would be distinct items to be reviewed in the future, but that itself is a one-time item. The Employee Development Fund could be a one-time item, or it could be something we would come back next year and say, we did our city university, we felt like it had a huge benefit to, helping staff, be more efficient, but that's not determined at this time. So amongst those, the one that is distinctly would be an annual ongoing ask would be the legislative advocacy, and of course the position.
Thank you.
Any other comments, questions? We'll open it for vote.
Chair Sanders,
Yes?
Vice Chair Hibbard,
Yes.
Committee Members Perez Andreessen,
Yes.
Holt,
Yes.
Keller,
Yes.
Louie,
Aye.
Prince,
Yes.
Roland,
Yes.
and Tobias.
Aye.
Motion is approved.
Thank you. Moving on to Recreation and Parks.
And if I may just really quickly to be clear, this is the rapid response team portion of Recreation and Parks and the equipment for Recreation and Parks.
So this doesn't include the Mason, or Kaiser Permanente or the other contingent projects?
That's on the next slide.
I think we should do one slide.
Yeah, I just wanted to just be clear for the committee. The 5.8 is the total cost between the two slides. I had to split up the slides just so you could actually read them up on the screen. But however you choose to take them, that would be fine. I just wanted to clarify that 5.8 is encompassing both the rapid response teams, the equipment, and all the capital projects.
Is there a motion? We'll do the whole thing, yeah.
I'll make a motion that the Recreation and Parks budget is consistent with the spending priority of the ballot measure, and make a recommendation to the City Council.
Second?
I'll second.
Is there any discussion? It's okay.
One for everyone. So I know we got through, we're calling it Phase 4 of Kaiser Permanente, and as much as these large capital projects that we started last year, I mean, once you get going, you almost got to finish them right, and it's unfortunate that it made it as disproportionate as it is. So I guess my first question is this it on Kaiser Permanente, or is there more to come?
We'll ask our department head to speak to that issue. As she comes up, I would say that based on the feedback that I've heard about Measure N funds and how to leverage those funds, my direction to staff has been to seek out grants, other funding opportunities, and try and use Measure N dollars to leverage those grants as opposed to block chunks of funding towards our regional parks.
Diane Hoover, Director of Recreation and Parks. Thank you. And thank you for the support of Recreation and Parks throughout this whole project opportunity. The Kaiser Permanente Sports Village is a huge complex, over 200 acres. On the two corners in Kaiser Permanente, we have the opportunities for commercial development. So that's on the corner of Ash and Gosford and Ash and Taft. The rest of the whole development is with sports opportunities for adults and youth as well. So the whole complex includes 16 soccer fields with a restroom in the middle and parking, and then 4 youth football fields, possibly 5, how they can configure that, a community center, 8 softball, baseball fields, and other walking paths and running areas throughout the whole complex. And the paths would be about, I think we estimated around 4 miles inside the park itself with the different configurations. What's good about this park as well is that it is just south of the water treatment plant, and so we use the extra water that comes from there on a purple pipe system, and we're able to irrigate the whole entire park with the purple pipe system from the water treatment plant. So it's a very positive type of opportunity. So last year, you funded $1.5 million for the whole master plan of the park, because there were some changes, as well as the detailed plans for the next phase, which is the youth football area. In the process, I was able to go for a Land and Water Conservation Fund grant, and we got the full amount of $3 million. That is a statewide federal grant, comes from the federal government to each state, and it is highly competitive grant. And we were funded the $3 million. It is dollar for dollar match on that particular grant.
And if you could, Diane, are there additional phases beyond phase 4?
Yes, so phase 4 includes the youth football, and so further phases will include the softball, baseball complex of 8 fields altogether, plus a community center, and we're hopefully, if good fortune continues, we'll be able to build a pool there as well, next to the community center. So yeah, there's different phases in that.
Thank you. So I had talked about the unfortunateness of the being disproportionate, and for me, Parks and Rec is a very geographical thing, right? Everything else we talked about, like response times for police officers and homelessness, that's kind of obviously a citywide issue, and you fix part of it, you kind of fix it all. And parks, like I said, are very geographical, and so spending as much money as we did last year and then this money on just those, 2 projects so far out of the city core, as was mentioned by Mr. Lane. I would just ask, and my question, I guess, is will it take a no vote for me to make this into the record, or can I still vote yes? And then it isn't so much for city council as maybe for city staff, that in future allocations, if we could have community involvement earlier on, especially with Parks and Rec.
The comments will be part of the record, regardless of whether it's a yes, no, or vote no. So your comments now have already been, stated for the record. So thank you for that. And again, I would reflect. I've heard the feedback about our regional amenities and wanting to make sure that we have a reasonable focus on our neighborhood parks. I feel like there's been a shift in this proposed budget significantly towards our neighborhood parks, and to my previous statement about trying to leverage these funds for other grant funds, I think makes a lot of sense. And then I would also just add that many of the contingent projects, as well as there are a number of capital projects that are happening in our neighborhood parks outside of PSVS in this coming year to the tune of several $1 million. And so, we recognize and understand that our neighborhood parks are an important priority along with our regional parks.
Ms. Hoover, can you elaborate just a little bit on the 1.4 under contingent projects for citywide beautification? Is there an actual plan there, or is that an allocation for future projects?
That's a total of all these, correct? Yeah, yeah.
Committee Member Hibbard, just for clarification purposes, so the 1.4 we talked about it last time as well, and again, we switched up kind of the compartmentalization of some of these items, so I apologize for the confusion. The $1.4 million is really speaking to those projects that would encompass sort of those hardscape entry point, first impression type of improvements that we would make, we have to, in our system, identify it with a certain department. In this case, we identified it with the Parks Department. We could easily consider that and differently if we wanted to. It's just how we have to work within our accounting system.
But also to answer your question specifically, no, there's not set projects been identified for that. We have received some feedback from the City Council through their strategic planning workshop of some areas they'd like us to consider for developing specific projects and concepts, but the locations and projects are not identified.
And a follow-up question to that, are the contingent projects, what's the trigger that'll say, yes, the contingent projects move forward, or no, they don't?
The trigger is reviewing our sales tax receipts over the first 2 quarters of next fiscal year, and then we'll come back at the mid-year budget adjustment with council and this committee to say, we've reviewed our revenues, we deem them to be sufficient. You know, our projections are that they'll be sufficient to do these projects, but it would come back before this group in the council.
This is for Mr. Hewitt. Just in your reclassification, last week the citywide beautification was under City Council. This week it's under Rex and Park, but it also has moved from non-contingent to contingent.
Yeah, and again, apologies for the oversight last week. It was meant to always be a contingent project based upon the anticipated revenues and the process we went through. So again, did not mean to confuse or mislead. It's intended to be a contingent project. It is compartmentalized under the Recreation and Parks Department for the time being. This committee, again, if you wanted to separate out that one item for consideration, I think that would be fine. I would not recommend that it would be moved from contingent to primary at this point, but if you wanted to consider it separately, you certainly could. And again, I apologize for the confusion.
And I guess maybe I missed the answer, Ms. Hoover. Mr. Holt asked if this was going to be it for Kaiser Permanente. This being phase 4, this is a phase 2 proposal that we're voting on today. I assume phase 1 was what we did last year, the 1.5 million for the master plan in year 1. So are we going to see funds requested for phase 3 and 5 and 6, and how many? How much is it going to be?
Actually, we've already built phase 1, 2, and 3. This funding is for phase 4, and that was part of the whole grant project as well. So this is what you're looking at here is phase 4.
And if I may, I think there's been some confusion over, we're using phase in 2 different modes. There's phase 1 and 2 of PSVS, and then there's the phases of the build out of this particular project. So before PSVS monies were requested, phases 1, 2, and 3 of the Kaiser Sports Village were completed. Phase 1 of PSVS included phase 4 of the Kaiser Village design, and phase 2 is having construction dollars for phase 4 of Kaiser construction. But to answer your question, there are other potential phases to the Sports Village. Ms. Hoover mentioned a softball complex, community center, and potential swimming pool. Again, those funds do not have to be earmarked for PSVS. Those funds, I think, would again be contingent on seeing if we can identify other sources. And again, it's a large complex that was designed to be built out in phases, and so it's not an assumption in my mind that next year for phase 3 of PSVS we would be looking at phase 5 of Kaiser. That's not my assumption.
I guess as a member of the public, then I would wonder, why are we using PSVS funds now and we might not in the future?
And to me, that's up to the committee and up to City Council to make that determination in the future for the future projects.
And if I may add too, again, as I mentioned last time, this committee is looking at a sliver of the city's entire budget. So the question is why PSVS versus other funding sources? In a nutshell, one of our primary sources for capital projects is hotel tax, and we are seeing a significant decrease in hotel tax. And so consideration for the use of other funding sources was taken into consideration by staff. Again, the ability to leverage $3 million in federal funding is dependent on the ability to utilize PSVS for this allocation. Moving forward, as circumstances change, priorities change, we will work closely with the Recreation and Parks Department to determine how best to move forward. But I absolutely concur with Mr. Clegg's statements that moving forward, it's not it will definitely be it will definitely not mean that there's a linear approach to PSVS funding as it relates to this regional sports complex or others. This is meant to leverage a grant, and Phase 4 will have, in my opinion, along with the other phases, independent utility essentially, which will go a significant way in meeting the needs and the demand for local sports, youth sports. Thank you.
Maybe I missed this part too. The $3 million federal grant that we obtained, is it required that we have a matching amount?
Yes, it is. The Land and Water Conservation Fund requires a 50% match. So dollar for dollar match.
So if we do not approve this component, we don't get that grant?
Yeah, like I said, a very competitive grant. We're very fortunate to get this grant and to be able to leverage it for the community. Let me just back up just a minute here. We do have 60 parks in the city of Bakersfield. The city is almost 400,000 population. Most of our parks are small neighborhood parks of 8, 10 acres, maybe 6 acres. And they are not big enough for youth sports. Youth sports has taken off in this community. We need big sports complexes for the youth of this community to gain opportunities to play soccer, softball, football, all of those things that youth develop and enjoy throughout their life. And this is a great opportunity. People all over the state are jealous of our opportunity here because we already own the land. We don't have to buy the land. It already is owned by the city of Bakersfield. Some wise people bought it a long, long time ago as part of the whole water treatment plant, and then decided to create these 200 acres for youth sports and opportunity for group team sports. Same way with Mies Marin out on the other side. It's a big chunk of land that we're able to work with agencies to provide sports and opportunities for youth and adults out there. Sorry.
And I just wanted to follow up, again, specific to the question, if this is not approved by the committee and the council, city staff does not have another source identified for this funding. Again, our general fund, we've cut significantly because of the reductions in anticipated revenues. Our transient and occupancy tax is also going to be about almost 25% less next year. And so we have not identified another funding source that could supplement that grant match.
You mentioned the commercial corners that are there. Is the intent that those get sold off and then those funds get used and reinvested into the Parks and Rec Department?
It would be either sold or leased. So yes, there is that opportunity. Whether it goes back to Parks and Recreation specifically, that's yet to be determined. But it is supposed that the commercial development that goes in there does somehow support the opportunities at the sports village, whether that's restaurants, gas stations, RV parking for the events that might happen there. I mean, there's just a lot of different opportunities that could go there.
And if I could also answer that a little bit from a citywide perspective, typically how I would approach department-specific projects, those don't necessarily always go back into department-specific, revenue streams. Typically, it's, back into the general fund. I think those are questions that we still have to answer, again, frankly, but I think it would be wisdom if we were looking at a phase 5. Wouldn't you want to leverage the proceeds to then fund a phase 5 as opposed to something else, or that the lease payments would go towards the maintenance of the facility? I think there are wise choices that we could explore, but that hasn't been determined.
And the only reason for the comment is that it's too early for those, except for the sports complex. So the sports complex creates the driver to allow it to happen. And so it seems like it should go back into your budget to offset maintenance and other things like that, or a land lease such as that. So
Well,
good opportunity going forward, and congratulations on the grant.
thank you.
Great work.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, yeah, I want to say congratulations. Great that you got the grant. I think it's great to leverage it. I'll reiterate my earlier points. I think the list of the community parks, that's really important. I won't belabor that point, but I see the Kaiser project as kind of a dual role as far as serving the needs of our local youth, and youth sports is very important. I mean, our police department runs a police athletic league for a reason, so it's vitally important to the community. But it also serves as a potential engine for tournaments and economic development. So I think moving forward, one suggestion I would have is if future phases come before this committee, it'd be really interesting to see. I don't know if there's any kind of economic impact report or study done on this, because it sounds like a very large park that could host very, very large tournaments.
Yes, and
it would generate a lot of hotel, bed tax, restaurant receipts, gas receipts, et cetera. It'd be interesting to see that from an economic development standpoint. Not that that's the primary purpose of the park, but it is a nice kind of icing on the cake.
That is correct. Thank you.
Quick comment. Has to do with something Mr. Eddie Lane brought up, and that is that, we're spending multi-million dollars on these sports complexes, and I think it's actually a good thing, and we have to match the grant that we got. It's a wonderful opportunity. Every major car manufacturer that has not yet released an electric vehicle is currently researching the way to release electric vehicles, and that segment is going to grow enormously. And I think that the city ought to be prepared and ought to consider going forward in every major complex or building or parking lot that the city builds, that electric charging stations be installed, and also with all that land out there, the consideration be given to solar panel tops for parking. I just want to make that point.
Mr. Rowland, in the master plan that is being developed right now, those things are included and being considered. So yes, so we do have the solar panels and the electric charging stations, thanks to the Sierra Club. So yes.
And also I want to give an opportunity to Nick Fiddler, our Public Works Director, to comment in general. There's actually quite a big solar project that's underway, and so Nick.
Chair, Committee Member Rowland, the Public Works Department is currently working on 2 separate projects. One is for solar installation at several city facilities, one of them actually being the Mason Wren complex. This facility right here in our parking lot, the courtyard, the park at Riverwalk. There are several facilities that we're looking at in general. We've submitted applications for both solar and battery backup systems. We are on a separate but parallel path working on a project to install vehicle charging stations at several facilities, one of them being at the park at Riverwalk. We haven't delved into Mason Wren or Sports Village at this point, but we are exploring several opportunities for both of those type of infrastructure.
We're going to open up for voting.
Chair Sanders,
Yes.
Vice Chair Hibbard,
Yes.
Committee Members Perez Andreessen,
Yes.
Holt,
Yes.
Keller,
Yes.
Louie,
Aye.
Prince,
Yes.
Roland,
Yes.
and Tobias.
Aye.
The motion is unanimously approved.
Madam Chair, I apologize. I need to go ahead and get back to the hospital. So on behalf of the committee members, I'm sorry, staff, thank you much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'd like to make a quick comment, if I could, to Mr. Eddie Lane. Mr. Lane, I want to make sure that you understand something, and that is that we understand that millions of dollars were just spent on or recommended for a sports complex, and yet we have little minor issues in a lot of our parks that need to be addressed, and I want you to know that that hasn't fallen on deaf ears, and that in the future, when we don't have to spend $3 million in one lump sum, we're going to consider all the things that the parks need. I think the parks are important to every single member of this committee and to the citizens.
Mr. Holt, did you want to add?
I did, yeah, just along those lines, just my earlier comments about the proportion of how it's spent, if I could make it into whatever's sent to the city council on this subject, and then also future community maybe involvement in that decision with Parks and Rec, since it is so geographical.
Thank you. Further comments? We'll go into the next slide and try to get through. I think we have 3. I'm debating whether we do a break, but if you guys can, we have, Jeannie, do we have 3 or do we go? Yeah, okay. Just making sure. So Mechanics, Bank Arena, Theater, and Convention Center.
I will make the motion that the Mechanics Bank Theater and Convention Center proposed allocation meets the guidelines of Measure N and be recommended to the City Council.
We have a motion.
Second.
Second from Member Holt. And we will open up for discussion.
I'd just like to make a quick comment, no question this time. Yay. So, you know, we talked about the big public, the service ones, and how this might not fall into that. So my reasoning on seconding it, and will be a yes vote, is more how it is weighted. It's not a lot of money. There's some bang for our buck there. And so anyways, I just wanted to say that.
I'd also like to add, Mr. Eckerson's not here this week. He was here last week. The Mechanics Bank Arena and Theater and Convention Center, I think is a really good revenue generator for the city. Like to see that happening as opposed to the police department becoming a revenue center, issuing more tickets and whatnot. Also, he mentioned last year that in the attendees for a lot of the concerts and events that we have at the convention center, through the tracking of the credit cards that are used to pay for them, that I think he said 30 or 35% of the attendees travel 50 or 100 miles to attend. So things that make the city look good to people outside that will keep them coming back, I think falls under just community development and boosts the economy, especially if we can get those people to stay overnight at the Marriott or someplace else. Then we have the transit occupancy tax and food and everything else.
Thank you, Mr. Louie. Any other comments this side? Great.
Yes,
Go ahead.
please. I too would like to make a comment in regards to this being a revenue generator for the community. And because of that fact, I will be voting no in regards to moving forward with these continued overhead costs. These are costs that I think should be included in the regular standard budget for the city. We spent last year, for an example, $500,000 on a scoreboard, and I too voted no at that time as well. I think this is one of the revenue generators of the community, and it needs to hold its own. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? With that, we'll open up for votes. It's okay. We'll go ahead and do a vote.
Chair Sanders,
No.
Vice Chair Hibbard,
No.
Committee Members Perez Andreessen,
No.
Holt,
Yes.
Louie,
Yes.
Prince,
No.
Roland,
No.
and Tobias.
No.
Motion fails with Committee Member Holt voting yes.
Louis voted yes also.
I was going to say.
Thank you, correction. Committee Members Holt and Louis voting yes.
We'll open up this time now for any extra comments, starting with Mr. Hibbard.
No comments.
Mr. Prince?
No comments. I've already stated. It's already on the record. Thank you.
Mr. Rowland? Mr. Tobias? We'll move on to the next one. Support services non-departmental. Mr. Hibbard has a question.
This is for Chris. You've already covered this once, but could you go over again the Cal VIP grant?
Actually, committee member through the chair, I'll take that one because it's a topic of a little bit of passion, actually. So my experience in Stockton was creating an Office of Violence Prevention, and this is related to that area. So when you look at group gun violence, that means gang violence, and typically that is the majority of gun violence that occurs in a community. It is usually driven, 70 to 80% of that violence is perpetrated by less than 0.1% of the population. And conducting some really in-depth analysis can really help you target down to know who are the 100, 200 people in this community doing 70 to 80% of the violence. But then once you know that, it's not as simple as we're going to go and arrest those 100 folks. It's having a team that can manage that issue by having a regular review on the law enforcement side of crime statistics, as well as an outreach team that can then go and try and reach out to these individuals and help pull them out of that lifestyle, as well as community supports that are on the back end. The City of Bakersfield has been working with the Safe Streets Coalition for a number of years to work at this issue. There's a $1.5 million grant that the state has available. This is an investment of about $250,000 of staffing costs that would leverage that $1.5 million to help fund some of the community outreach and this analysis to really hone in our focus and see some pretty significant results. Where this program has been used in other communities, it's been used on the East Coast in a few communities. It's been used in the Bay Area. We did it in Stockton. A version of this has been used in Los Angeles and San Bernardino. This is the evidence-based program that delivers the highest return on investment, where you can see double-digit reductions in gun violence and or homicides. Typically, it can take a couple of years to see some of those results. In the city of Stockton, we saw an initial 50% reduction in our first year. It ticked back up in subsequent years. And then in 2018 and 19, we saw a 40% reduction in homicides that was then sustained. So these positions would manage this grant and project to keep a really keen focus on gun violence to drive towards those same kind of results.
Thank you. Is there a reason it's here versus in the police department?
That's a great question, and this is something the chief and I are actually still in conversation about. But I would say the perception sometimes of the very highest risk of gun violence, those that are in that lifestyle, If it's perceived as a law enforcement project, it can sometimes impact their willingness to participate in some of our case management and some of our programming. And so having really tight coordination with law enforcement, but outside of law enforcement, can yield some better results.
What are the ongoing costs? I mean, if we hire, first of all, we don't have this grant, right? We're going to apply for this grant, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and assuming that we get it, we're going to hire 2 people at a cost of $200,000, and that'll be ongoing. Typically, how long is the grant money good for? Meaning, will it sustain us for 3 years, 5 years?
The grant money is good for 3 years. I'm looking at this, and this is a good question too, committee member, thank you. And through the chair, I consider this a seed money or pilot to create this program and leverage those grant funds, but would then look to maintain those efforts over time, because you don't treat this problem for 3 years and then it just goes away. I think that this is something that does need to be sustained. And so I do consider these positions ongoing positions that we would maintain beyond the life of the grant. But we want to get that 1.5 million to leverage it to help us, kickstart some of the analysis as well as the community partnership.
I think it sounds like a great program. I just wonder if this is the year to do it, given our current economic situation.
Does it have to be city employees? Can it be outsourced?
It can be, I believe it could be by contract. I think that the coordination that we would lose with the tightness with PD and having, city employees that are under the direction of the city manager. In San Bernardino, it's a contract model. In Oakland, it's a contract model. I think Oakland has worked fairly well, San Bernardino not, and so it could be done. It just is a question about sort of the institutional investment and that tight coordination, but it is an option.
I have another question. Is this grant that we're applying for, is it a time sensitive, or is this an ongoing amount of funds that could be applied for next year?
It does have a specific time frame. The grant is actually due in the next few weeks, and it's for the next 3-year period, as I mentioned. Typically, the state has cycled through these grants every 2 to 3 years. Whether or not the state is able to do that in 2 years, we don't know, but it does cycle through every couple of years.
I'll make a motion that the support services non-departmental are consistent with the spending priorities of the ballot measure and make a recommendation to the city council.
We have a motion. Is there a second?
I don't hear a second, but I just want to make sure I understand Committee Member Holt correctly. I'm looking at both of these slides as one item, just like we did with Rec and Parks. So it's the Phase 2 total proposed of a little over $4 million. Is that your understanding, sir?
It is.
Thank you. And I'm sorry, for whatever reason, my microphone has radio static, but I had a motion and I didn't hear a second.
We don't have a second.
I'll second.
We have a second. Mr. Prince? Any discussion? Yes.
So this is the one that includes the recruitment efforts for police. I guess we kind of already approved that one, but we're reapproving it, I guess. So, but I had a question on the, what was it? Oh, street lighting study or implementation. So, and I can't recall if we discussed this was that just last week? It seems like a year ago. But is this implementation of the earlier studies we had done? We were talking so the Phase 1, we did some street lighting study, or we funded some studies of street lights. Is this kind of a continuation of that?
Chair, Committee Member Tobias, we are currently in the process of doing a streetlight study to evaluate areas to add additional streetlights. We've completed a program to retrofit all the existing streetlights, actually take that back. Last year's program was to take the remainder of the decorative streetlights and convert them from a high-pressure sodium or metal halide decorative light to a LED light. This study is to look at where in the city we need to add additional streetlights for safety purposes. So the study is currently, we're working with the consultant. It is planned to be awarded at the June 24th meeting. There was a delay in the award of the project. We had a contractor that we were working with. We were proposing to award early in February. However, when COVID-19 hit, that company withdrew their proposal, so we had to go back to another vendor and start that process. So we are proposing for the June 24th meeting to continue with the streetlight study.
Okay, and then this is implementation, so this would be money that would be put aside to implement whatever that study.
That's correct.
Okay.
They will
Again,
evaluate areas of the city, whether it be pedestrian, vehicle, areas that the police department have identified as high crime activity. Those areas are what are going to be evaluated by the consultants to determine whether or not additional streetlights are needed. And from that list, we will prioritize the streetlight locations and add them as recommended by the study.
Okay, so they'll look at crime activity and also pedestrian vehicle accidents, that kind of stuff.
That's correct.
Okay.
Mr. Fiddler, the lighting study includes the bike path?
At this point, we have not got into that detail. There has been some requests, so potentially it could involve some of the bike path locations that are heavily traveled near parks that may have a little bit more, need a little bit more enhancement. Again, that will be studied based off of pedestrian activity, accident activity, and crime activity.
Okay, in regards to the areas where the bike path goes underneath the roadway, is that depending on the roadway, is it a responsibility of the city, or if it goes under the highway, like the West Side Parkway, that area, is that the responsibility of Caltrans?
So there is some separate projects in regards to that. We do have a project to do what we call a soffit lighting, where we actually add lighting underneath the bridge structure itself. So it's not typically a street light per se. It's actually applying a light to the bottom of the bridge structure. So there was a project, and I can't remember the exact location of that area, but most of the bridges do have soffit lighting, and we do try to put maintain those soffit lights.
All right, we have a motion and a second. We'll go ahead and open up for voting.
Chair Sanders,
Yes?
Vice Chair Hibbard,
No.
Committee Members Perez Andreessen.
No.
Would you mind repeating that?
No.
Thank you. Committee Member Holt,
Yes.
Committee Member Louie,
Aye.
Prince,
Yes.
Rowland,
No.
and Tobias.
Aye.
Motion is approved with members Hibbard, Andreessen, and Rowland voting no.
I'll open up to any of the no votes that would like to leave an extra comment.
I would like to comment that many of these positions look like they could be outsourced, and this appears to be the exact thing we want to avoid, which is creating a huge overhead that goes long-term, that grows and grows and grows. Outside of the lighting study, which I don't really think should be lumped in there with all of the technical folks, all of the jobs in the top slide, even the Calvet grant, which I think is a great program in concept, I would much rather see us outsource initially. If it works and we have a funding source that's identified and a way to do it, then let's hire somebody. But let's stop hiring over and over again and creating this huge fixed cost that we can never undo. It's just too dangerous.
Thank you. Mr. Rowland?
I concur with Committee Member Hibbard.
Thank you. Mrs. Perez Andreessen?
I voted no, just because I think we should wait until we have a better picture of what our revenue is going to look like in a few months.
Thank you. We will go on to support services, sorry, so that was it. Sorry, it was up on my screen. That concludes our voting.
In respect of everyone's time, I did comment earlier, a recommendation to move into the specific dialogue. And I think that there has been very good dialogue and comment along the way. I think committee members also gave some general comments before we began that are on the record and very meaningful and very helpful. But I did suggest that we get into the specific recommendations and reserve opportunity for those that wanted to make general comments towards the end. And so would just, reflect that and open to receive those, but also know that it's been a long afternoon.
Madam Chair, if I may, point of order, and maybe this is something that Ms. Gennaro could answer. Now that we've been provided with the minutes from the May 26th meeting, should we vote on that since it's on the agenda?
That would be helpful if you've all just taken a few minutes to look through it, at least just to review and file.
Since I did watch the video, can I vote on that even though I wasn't at the meeting?
Review and file would be okay.
Madam Chair, I make a motion to approve the minutes of the May 26th meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Louie. Do we have a second?
I second that motion.
Mr. Tobias, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Sounds like all of us.
Motion is approved.
While we're under comments, I'll make it quick, I
Yep.
promise. I just wanted to say that I'm very honored to be part of this conversation and appreciate, like I said earlier, the hard work that city staff has done.
Thank you. Anybody else wish to leave a comment?
One quick thing, and that is, this is a very unique year in that we had to really get through this process. You guys had to get through a budget process quickly and under horrible conditions, but next year, I want this committee to allow time for public comments long before maybe we get to this point where we have to vote on these things. To be honest with you, I don't think we had the opportunity for any public comments with the exception of a few minutes in the last 2 weeks. So next year, let's make it a point to maybe even have a measure in committee meeting in which we solicit comments from the public about what they would like to see in the coming year before we even get to the point of a budget proposal. Just a thought.
That's a good suggestion.
I also have a comment, Madam Chair. Sure. I mentioned this to the city clerk last week. The presentation of the budget material that was given to us last week, I don't think was as clear as what we got today, subtotaling by departments and what's capital, what's contingent and whatnot. It was a little difficult to go through all the pages and try to add up the numbers and try to get to the bottom line to see what money was being spent where and on what. They were just all line items last time and not presented as the way we got it last year, where it was easier to see subtotal by department, if you will, and see how much money was totaling up to in this case, 69,520,000.
Thank you, Mr. Louie. I just wanted to suggest that the comments and the voting, I understand it's going to be compiled into a letter and given to the city council. And what was the date on that again?
The goal is to have that for the council for our June 8th workshop. Hopefully, we can compile that information sooner than the day of the 8th, but we want them to at least have that for their next workshop on the 8th.
Okay, can I just recommend that we also get a copy of it, like over email, just so that we see all of our...
Yeah, it will be a matter of public record, and so we're happy to share that.
Great, thank you.
Is that a June 8th workshop, not meeting, council meeting?
It technically is a council meeting. We call it a budget workshop because we're going through the budget and they're not voting on it on that day, to be clear. But it is technically a meeting of the city council, and so it'll be a public meeting with, public comment and decorum. But again, just to review the calendar, the workshop is on the 8th. The public hearing for first reading of budget is on the 10th of June. Final budget adoption on the 24th of June.
So I was just wondering, point of clarification, since we haven't approved it, so you're not sending minutes to the council, I guess, since we haven't approved our minutes? It's more of like a letter format, is that what it is?
It'll be a summarization
Summary.
of what we, understood and heard, and we'll take it verbatim as much as we can, but we're having folks, taking notes as we go, but it'll be a summary.
Connie, do you have any finishing thoughts, questions?
I do not.
Great. With that, we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everybody.